My name is Keith Fanjoy. I'm the director of a program called Bester Community of Hope, which is an initiative of SanMar. Many of you have come to several of these events over the past few years, and the story of Bester Community of Hope is not new to you. But for those that have not come to these, I want to just very quickly explain who we are and what we do. We're a part of SanMar, and SanMar for 135 years almost, 1883, has been providing foster care services, residential programming, treatment foster care, and most recently, a mental health clinic on our Boonesboro campus. And so it was about 4 or 5 years ago that we were very concerned with the children that were leaving our program, as well as the intensity of the needs of the children that were coming to us. And we were asking questions about what do we need to do to get to these kids earlier, and how do we, and certain board members also asked us, how do we make sure that when they leave, they're in a position for success? And then so we wrestled with this all throughout 2013, and we were very fortunate at the end of 2013, we began a dialogue at SanMar and connected with Casey Programs, which is a national foundation based in Seattle, Washington. That conversation led us to establish a partnership and say, we're not really sure what this community work is going to look like, but SanMar and our board of directors is committed to proceeding with looking at prevention. How do we, as an organization, stop children from having to enter these systems of care, and what does that look like? Over the series of about 6 months, we pulled together a lot of community stakeholders, some of you who are in this room, and asked those questions, saying, where geographically are our services most needed, and how do we come alongside existing efforts to make a difference? We identified Bester Elementary School and the neighborhood that surrounded it as the place where we would collaborate with neighborhood stakeholders in the school, and we got started. And at that same time, we began a dialogue with folks from the Fletcher Foundation based in Hagerstown to try to think about how we could get started with having full-time people in the community doing this work. And the following year, we were very fortunate. The Fletcher Foundation gave a very substantial commitment and invested in the work, and we moved across the street. We still have our main operation in Boonesboro, but we moved across the street and opened a satellite office in the neighborhood. So I could go on and on about Bester Community of Hope. I would take all your time, but here to see me today. So I want to talk very quickly about the people that are making this possible today and the work that we're doing in the community and in the school. These are people such as Mr. Bill Young and his board at the Fletcher Foundation, Casey Family Programs, folks like Paul DiLorenzo, who some of you have met before. And specifically, I want to bring attention to Washington County Department of Social Services. There are a good number of those staff members here who have put a lot of time and energy over the years in working with populations that are vulnerable in a very trauma-informed way. And specifically, the leadership of Mike Piercy, Tiffany Rexroad, and Lesia Teodorovicki. I always say it wrong, Lesia. I'm sorry, wherever you are. You know, those folks, really, we couldn't do this work that we're attempting to do in the community without them. So if you guys could just take a minute and give them a hand, I would really appreciate that. Bester Community of Hope is really a two-prong approach. We do a lot of systemic work in the community and the school, trying to identify gaps and attaching partners to those gaps so that kids wake up in the morning, and from the time they wake up till the time they go to sleep, they have access to what they need. But sometimes kids and families, they fall through certain cracks and they have needs that maybe those resources can't provide. And so the other prong of our work is family support services, where we go into homes, we meet with children and families, and we try to get a sense of what they need based on what they tell us. And those are the big two things. And the two people in our organization that help us make that happen are Jen Yonker, who's a clinical social worker who leads our family support service work, and Carrie Fair, who leads a lot of the work in our after-school programs and our school-based services. If you could please give both of them a hand as well, I appreciate that. So Before we get started, I just want to do some housekeeping. We'll have coffee and snacks out there. We'll have a break around 9:50 after Dr. Anda's keynote presentation. There's bathrooms both around the corner here down the hall, and there's also some hidden upstairs. Those are the secret ones you don't know about. So to introduce our first speaker today, I'd like to welcome the Director of Washington County Social Services, Mr. Mike Piercy.
So we'd like to thank everyone for coming out. At the Washington County Department of Social Services, we're still in process of becoming a trauma-informed agency, and we'd like to thank Dr. Anda for the work he's done. You know, the work with the adverse child events research helps us understand that traumatic events, not just with our clients, but with ourselves, colors and shades all the events and all the relationships in our lives. And we much appreciate his work with this. And we're grateful for the work that he continues to do, not only to help inoculate us against the events that are going to happen in our lives, but then also begin the process for healing. So without belaboring it, we'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Robert Anda.
Morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Whether you like it or not, Keith gave me a whole hour to talk to you, so you can decide whether that was too much or too little after I'm done. And I love hearing about a community of hope. I have the honor to travel around the country and teach this information, and more what I'm doing is going into communities and training groups of people to teach in their communities to everyone in the community and to all of the service systems that provide human services, so this information can spread even more broadly than it already is. And so I'm really happy to hear what Keith said about the integration of this information, teaching it to people that have been affected by adversity, and teaching the systems that serves them so that they can come together and we can develop synergy so that change will happen more rapidly for this generation and for generations to come. So I have this idea of self-healing communities. And when I first started talking about this, people thought that I was talking about some kind of utopian pie-in-the-sky thing that nobody could ever do. But I can assure you that as I travel and we teach this, and as whole communities and now whole states do this over years, communities start to change. And the change comes from within the communities. Every community is different. I'm sometimes asked as I present this information as if I'm supposed to have a magic wand. And I don't have a magic wand. You have the magic wand. You have the initiative and the creativity here in this community to find the solutions that work for you locally. So I'm really into this community-based approach. And this is my idea of what a self-healing community sort of looks like. You have to forgive the engineering design. I couldn't come up with something else besides these gears. But if you look at these gears, that's the human potential that's locked in each of those gears. What is the biggest gear in this model of self-healing communities? The most powerful gear. It's the people who've been affected by or experienced adverse childhood experiences. Everywhere surveys have been done, not just in the ACE study that Dr. Folletti and I did, but everywhere it's been done, in every state, in every community, and even now around the world. The World Health Organization is replicating adverse childhood experiences studies in different countries and cultures, and every time I see that information come in, it looks pretty much the same. So the power comes from the people affected by adversity, because that's the majority of the population everywhere we go. And then what we want to do is take this not only to the general public, but to every service sector that works with them, so that they can change their policies and practice in a way that works better for people that have been affected by adversity. We have inadvertently developed policies and practices that we'll talk about a little bit today that tend to make things worse. And it wasn't done intentionally. We didn't know better. We'll be talking about that and how different service sectors can do better. I always enjoy seeing seeing quotes from famous scientists that I learned about when I was training. This is a quote from Louis Pasteur. And he said, "When I approach a child, he inspires me in two sentiments: tenderness for what he is and respect for what he may become." You know, over the past 2 years, even when my kids were little, I was traveling a lot, so I always brought photos of my kids. That's my son, Will. His first word was ball. Ball, Daddy. He's always carrying a ball. He just graduated from college. He's 22 years old now, and he joined the Peace Corps, and he's in Cambodia now. He's been there for 2 months and about to be assigned to a village in Cambodia, and he's very proud that he's now able to learn the language and speak the language. He's going to be doing health education in Cambodia. I will. It's Will. What we're learning now, which is really important as we teach about ACEs, is what we didn't know, all of the biology I'm going to talk about for maybe the next 10 minutes of why the effects of adversity are so powerful. It's because we now understand the biology of it, how it works. And I think understanding the biology helps people to have more compassion when interacting with people affected by adversity. When I talk about adversity, I'm talking about stress. It's code for stress. We all know about the fight or flight response that evolution gave us that helps us to survive under dangerous conditions. And that is a chemical response. Our adrenal glands release two chemicals, adrenaline and cortisol, when we're put under stress. The adrenaline raises our heart rate and makes our muscles stronger so that we can fight or flee to get away from danger. Adrenaline is a neurotransmitter. Our nerve cells talk to each other through gaps. If you know about neurotransmitters, they talk through gaps. Adrenaline is one of those chemicals that helps nerves talk to each other. So if you can imagine a developing brain, a child's developing brain, if it's flooded repeatedly by a neurotransmitter, it may make it more difficult for those systems that are developing and talking to each other to develop the way that we would want them to develop. And probably even more importantly, there is a steroid hormone called cortisol. Cortisol in repeated doses or high doses is toxic to brain cells. It makes it difficult for those brain cells to make connections. And in animal studies, high levels of cortisol actually can kill brain cells. So we have this wonderful stress response, but if the stress is unpredictable or severe, like we see here, it leads to vulnerability, and that is a biologic vulnerability of the effect of the chemistry of stress on the way our nerve cells wire up or don't wire up. If it's predictable or moderate, it leads to resilience. And in this sense, I talk about resilience that if we don't get overwhelmed biologically by stressors, we can calm ourselves down and be ready for the next one and handle the stresses of life. So if there are many episodes of stress or adversity, or if it's chronic, if it goes on day after day or week after week or month after month or year after year, there is more exposure to the chemistry of stress and therefore a higher likelihood of biologic vulnerability. I'll be talking a little bit more over the next few minutes about how this affects neurodevelopment, brain development, and the new field of epigenetics, which I think explains a lot of why adversity and trauma and stress have such long-lasting effects on the way we grow and develop. This is the cover art from an American Medical Association newspaper that came out right about the time I just started learning about all of this. Because I'm a physician, I wasn't trained in this. I had to learn it by doing it. And I saw this cover art. This was the first time the American Medical Association tried to teach physicians around the early 90s that domestic violence might have health implications. And so an artist created this cover art, and I show it today. I know it can be difficult to look at, it's painful. We have a child who's being stressed by the behavior of the parents, and we just learned about the biology of stress. So potentially, but not necessarily, this child's brain development and human development may be affected by these kind of events in that family setting. And it took me a few years of showing this to audiences where where the light bulb went off about the parents. Because when I first saw this, I said, what's wrong with those parents? Why are they doing that? So I don't ask that question. I might say, what were their experiences like? Why do they have difficulty regulating their emotions? Why are they doing this? Why might there be violence in this home? Why might there be mental illness or substance abuse in the home, or the other things that tend to go along with violence? I say, what happened to them? And more importantly, how do we help the parents who've been affected by adversity to do a better job so there is less stress for this child and the generations to come? Our job is to wind down the intergenerational cycle of the transmission of adversity and stress and trauma from one generation to the next. And we can do better now, a little bit better now, and a little bit better next year, and for the next generation, and for the generations to come. We will see a lower percentage of people with the major health and social problems I'll be talking about today. So it's about compassion. I now have compassion for those parents. When I first saw this, I didn't. Here is a sketch of brain cells. On the far left, here at birth, there's about a dozen brain cells. And we come into this world, we're born as infants. We don't come wired up, right? We're not computer boards, right? What do we need to do when we're born? Not a lot of real complicated things. I mean, they're important things, but they're not complicated. We need to find a breast, right? And suck, right? Yeah? And we know how to look at a mama's face and begin to attach and know what a face looks like and all the little things that infants do. So we come in only wired for the things that we need at the time, and over time, sequentially, the brain gets ready to do the things it needs to do by getting experience from around us. That's what this middle panel shows. At 6 years old, those same dozen nerve cells have thousands or hundreds of thousands of interconnections. The making of connections in neural networks in the brain is dependent upon the nature of the experience. The more experience comes into that section of the brain, wherever it might be, from our senses, from the environment around us, the more wiring occurs. At puberty, at around age 14, there are fewer connections than at age 6. There's a process that comes in around the time of puberty that's called pruning, wherein the least experienced networks tend to withdraw, and they sort of lay dormant there. We used to think that they went away, but they actually lay dormant, which is really hopeful as we talk about brain development and changes that can be made, that if we get those experiences later on, it's called plasticity, neuroplasticity. They're dormant, and so there's the hope that some of those things that maybe weren't experienced can be experienced, and our brains can change. This is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. It's called Persistent Stress Changes Brain Architecture. Here we have, under the microscope, see that brain cell? It's really colorful and pretty, like a Christmas tree. That's a healthy brain cell. That one's ready to make a lot of connections and develop healthy communications to the nerve cells around it. This is a cell exposed to a lot of adversity, or some people call that toxic stress, and you can see that it's not as healthy. If you take a little section of this one, little tiny section, and put it under a high-power microscope, you see it here. The little lumpy, bumpy things are where that brain cell is ready to branch out and talk to, send the neurotransmitters to an adjacent cell and develop a network. Down below, in this cell that's been exposed to a lot of adversity, it has fewer of those little buds and less ability to connect. That's what we're talking about, the effect of the biology of stress on the health of our nerve cells. I'm going to talk for a few minutes. I'm learning this field now. How many people here have heard or read about epigenetics? How many people could try to teach it to somebody else? Okay, well, I'm not very good at it either, but I'm going to try this morning, okay? Epigenetics, really important. I think this is one of the most important findings in understanding human development and human biology ever. It's very exciting. So we all know we have chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells, and that's really tightly compressed DNA. It has to be tightly compressed to fit in the cells. I'm told that the DNA, if you put it all strung and all together, would be about as tall as me. So you can imagine something like that being packed inside this little tiny nucleus of a cell. In order for the DNA to be used, it has to unwind from that tightly packed state. And this is what this diagram shows, the unwinding. And you see these little yellow balls. Those are proteins. And the little band is the DNA that's wrapped around the proteins. I like to think about a fishing reel. You know, if you went fishing without a reel and took your line and threw it overboard, you'd have this tangled thing that wouldn't work very well, right? So that's what happens with our DNA. It has to be packed and it has to unwind. And here, you see, it's getting ready to be used. And then it finally unwinds, and here are the genes. Genes are like, if the palm of my hand is a gene, it's got a message on it. It says to the cell, make a protein that tells that cell to do something really important that our body needs to make these bodies and for us to function. So it's a message to the cell. And you see these little orange cones here? Those are chemicals that can attach at the point where this is ready to unwind so the gene can talk to the cell. Those can block that unwinding point so the gene can't be opened up. It's still attached to the protein. That's epigenetics. And one of the common chemicals is a methyl group. It's called methylation patterns. What does it have to do with today? It has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. Stress and adversity and our experiences of life can change which genes are available to talk to our cells. And therefore, all the cells of our body, the way they function, can be altered by our experience by attaching a chemical to this point so the gene can open up to be read. It can also unattach these chemicals. So we have this really dynamic, our DNA, I believe it, our DNA learns. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's like our DNA learns from our experience, and it makes a lot of sense because if it didn't learn, we wouldn't be able to adapt to all these complex things that happen to us and be ready for the environments that we live in. And this is central to the idea of the compassion and being trauma-informed that I think we'll understand a little bit in a few minutes. So that's epigenetics. And here's the hopeful part in your community of hope and the communities that I go and talk to is if adverse experiences influence gene expression, my belief is that when we do things better, that may reverse the kind of things that happen in epigenetics so that we can heal better and do better. So the memory of our experiences is stored in our bodies. I'm going to move now to an overview of the concepts and findings around adverse childhood experiences. We have this, what we call the Adverse Childhood Experiences Pyramid. And it's a whole life model from conception to death. So if you imagine this whole life model going up here through the pyramid, time going up this way, the hours and days and weeks and months and years, decades going up here. Our society tends to come in here when there is already risk behavior or social, emotional, and cognitive impairments or disease, disability, and social problems. Our society has learned to do that, and it's not a bad thing, but it tends to be ineffective. I mean, I'm trained in internal medicine. My colleague, Dr. Folletti, is an internist, so we came together and said, you know, we're doing this, but might there be something that might be more effective? And I'm not criticizing anything we do once things say we want to continue. If I get injured, I want there to be an emergency room. If I get sick, I want a treatment to be available. But this is really expensive, and in many cases is not as effective as we would like it to be. And so we said, well, what about what is the foundational aspect of the origins of our major health and social problems? Where do they really come from? And if we can unearth that, then we can do true primary prevention. So what we now know is that ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, disrupt neurodevelopment. We didn't know that the first 10 years that we published it. We had to learn about the neuroscience afterwards, leading to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, to risk behaviors, to disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. That's the model we used. And we now learned in the last few years about this really powerful effect of experience on the way our genes are used, and therefore the way our cells function. And looking back on that cover art that I showed you of that family at the dinner table, we need to reduce the intergenerational transmission. It's almost like a virus. It's passed from person to person, from one generation to the next. So, of course, we work with children, but we need to work with the people who have been affected by adversity so they don't pass it on. That's how it works. It's like with viruses, they call it vertical transmission. It's transmitted down from one generation to the next. So the ACE study that I'll talk about for a few minutes examines the health and social effects of ACEs throughout the lifespan among more than 17,000 people. Briefly, who were these people? They were in a primary care setting in San Diego. They're a well-educated group of people. Most had been to college. Only 6% did not have a high school diploma. Mostly middle class, upper middle class community, which is what San Diego is. The weather's always good, and there's beaches and cool things to do, so people want to live there. Predominantly white. And they have some of the best health care in the world. And I now think of these 17,000 people, looking back on doing this, developing this in the 90s. If I wanted to go out and get 17,000 people into a really big study who had these social characteristics and who were probably as healthy a group of people as you could find in this country, it would be hard to do this again. So as we look at the level of adversity in this population, and when we scratch the surface and see just how much that adversity affected them, you can imagine the effects this might have in different populations of people. So this, in a way, is sort of the best case scenario of how much adversity there is and the impact it has on populations. The first thing that we found that I did not know, because I was studying cardiovascular disease at the CDC when I somehow stumbled into this ACE thing. So I didn't know any of this. ACEs are common. And when I saw that, I was the first person to see the data come in from the Kaiser Health Plan. I saw what I'm going to show you now, and I wept, because I didn't know. The first group we called household dysfunction. 27% of those people grew up with substance abuse in their home. 1 in 4 with the stress, the relational stress that can go along with parental separation or divorce. 17% had mentally ill people in their home. 13% witnessed their mothers being physically abused. And 6% had criminal behavior in the home, as evidenced by having someone in their home incarcerated while they were growing up. 3 forms of childhood abuse. 11% had been psychologically abused, 28% physically abused, and 1 in 5 had been sexually abused. 15% had been emotionally neglected, and 10% physically neglected. Neglect is not getting those experiences in our environment so that those networks can develop and be healthy and function. So that's the absence of the experiences that we would like to have to function. They're common. The next thing we saw is that those 10 experiences are highly interrelated. This was new information when we did this, because nobody had ever really gathered this array of adversities in one study before. This was new. They come in groups. So the way I'd like to teach this to you this morning is, if you were one of the 17,000 people in our study, and you reported to us that you grew up with substance abuse in your home, okay, that would be your first ACE. There are 10 of them. Your chance of having one of those additional adversities is 81% on average. So 8 out of 10 of you would have one of the others. So that's one stressor, two stressors. If you go to the far right, almost 60% of you would have 4 or more. So you start adding up the stress, one here, plus 4 or more. 60% of you, if you have that, would have 5 or more childhood stressors. The way we dealt with that, which many of you are familiar with, is we created a simple score called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE score. It was the sum of those 10 experiences. So the score ranged from 0 to 10. Each experience just counted 1 point. We didn't count one more than the other, so you count them up and create a score. And now that we know how this works, now that we understand the biology, I think of the score as a cumulative measure of how much stress experience there was, how much biology of stress there was during childhood. So what we found in the Kaiser Health Plan is only 1 in 3 had none of those, an ACE score of 0. 26% had 1. And when you get down here to 4 or more, 16% had 4 or more. So most of people, 67%, 2/3, had at least 1. And high levels of adversity were common in that population. So let's now go to the ACE model and go through some of the health effects. Adolescent health. Here we have the percentage of people who initiated drug use by age 14 is the height of these red bars. It goes from 1%, 2, 3, 4, to 10% as the score, the biologic stress dose, goes from 0 to 1 to 5 or more childhood adversities. Now, as an epidemiologist and researcher, you almost never see a graph like this. Okay? Researchers spend their careers torturing data to try to get something that looks like this. We call it dose response, so you can publish it. Okay? Now, as this data come in, we started generating all these graphs that showed this dose response, and I was taking it to my colleagues at the CDC, and they said they didn't believe me. They said, you did something wrong. There's something in your computer program that's artifactually generating dose response graphs over and over again. So, of course, the computer programming was checked and it's correct. But here, this is something you hardly ever see in looking at experiences or exposures influencing human health. This bar is 10 times higher than that bar. So the risk of early initiation of drug use is 10 times higher for an ACE score of 5 compared to 0. And these are really big too. This is doubling, tripling, quadrupling in between. Dose response. Dose response. This is adversity and women telling us retrospectively if they ever had at least one teen pregnancy. As the score goes from 0 to 7, 8 or more, it goes from 15% to almost 60%. About mental health and substance abuse. Here's addiction. This is people self-reporting that they are addicted to some kind of drug. Looks very much like the early initiation graph. That's about 10 times higher than that. That's 2, 3, 4 times higher. Alcoholism. This graph is a little bit different. Here, this is people self-reporting that they're alcoholics with the score going from 0 to 4 or more here, increasing biologic stress dose. This is about 18%, that's 3%. So you see these stepwise doubling, tripling, quadrupling. That's 6 times higher than that, 6-fold increase in the risk of alcoholism. We're also interested in relationships because we're talking about the effects on children. This is growing up for both men and women and getting into a relationship and marrying an alcoholic. And I'm going to stop for a minute. There's no blame, right? We've stopped doing, there's no shame and blame in any of this stuff. Because if you're not trauma-informed already, hopefully you will be over the next few minutes. We've stopped doing that. We now understand, we see these powerful patterns in the biology, but we now understand why things are the way they are so that we can change the nature of our relationships between each other and have compassion, understanding, and come up with solutions rather than shaming and blaming. Here's attempted suicide. Attempted suicide was the most non-random thing we saw in all the data. So you look at this and you see this 20-fold increase in the risk of suicide attempts here compared to here, and it can look really scary, and it's a terrible thing. But if it's so non-random, that means we can prevent it. Are you with me? I'm a prevention guy. Okay? These are really non-random health and social problems. They're so non-random. The fact that they're so non-random makes them highly preventable when we wind down the cause. And in this case, the cause is the intergenerational transmission of adversity. So this is highly preventable. It's not easy, but we can do that. So here's a quick overview. I believe that these kinds of experiences and their biologic impact on human development are the most important public health problem in our country and around the world. They have a strong influence on adolescent and reproductive health, smoking, obesity, alcohol and drug use, sexual behaviors, mental health, the risk of violence and re-victimization later on in life as adults, the stability of relationships, the stability of neighborhoods and communities and nations, and the performance in the workforce, people's ability to do their jobs. ACEs are a pathway to major causes of death in the U.S. Here is liver disease. Do we get the dose response graphs? Right? Self-explanatory. So if you would have asked, if you go to a liver expert somewhere here in Maryland and say, what is one of the major causes of liver disease? Do you think that liver disease expert would say adverse childhood experiences? I want to prevent cirrhosis. And I'm not putting anybody, you asked me 10 years ago about cardiovascular disease, what are you talking about? How do you get liver disease? Let's say it's New Year's Eve. We're having a party here in this community college, and we say, my resolution is I'm going to get liver disease this year. That's what I'm going to do. What would you do? You'd expose your liver to toxic substances like alcohol, or you would try to infect yourself with one of the viruses that's transmitted through drug use, contaminated needles and syringes, and through sexual behavior. It's a sexually transmitted disease. ACEs, the pathway that leads to liver disease here, goes through the adaptations and behaviors that are a consequence of those experiences and increase the risk of liver disease. Here's heart disease, the leading cause of death for men and women in the United States. At high levels of adversity, nearly doubles. A lot of this is not explained by the known risk factors. We went through this statistically. It's not only about a third of this relationship out here is due to the risk factors that we're all familiar with that cause heart disease. There's something else. And my guess is it's probably that epigenetic keyboard thing of the turning on and off of genes that we're just beginning to learn about. In the years to come, we'll probably understand the physiology, the biology of how that works. Here's some of the leading causes of death caused by ACEs. Heart and lung disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, especially lung cancer, liver disease, suicide, injuries, HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases, and autoimmune diseases. These experiences tend to ramp up the immune response in people's bodies, so there's an increased risk of things like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or other autoimmune diseases. And at the tip of the ACE pyramid is early death, so premature mortality. In the ACE study, we followed these people forward in time and got the death certificates to people that died, and we saw that for people with ACE scores of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years younger than the people with ACE scores of 0. So how many folks here are trauma-informed? Okay. Now, I learned this about 10 years ago. I was at a meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'd done a presentation, and somebody said, well, why don't you come to the trauma-informed work group? I said, well, what is that? What's a trauma-informed work group? So, and what I was expecting is that being trauma-informed was a protocol. because I'm a physician, I like protocols, I like menus. If you tell me what to do, I'll do this, 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 and this, and then it will get better, or maybe not, but hopefully better. Being trauma-informed is not a protocol. There aren't protocols for this. Being trauma-informed is a conceptual frame shift that takes it from what's wrong with you. Why are you doing it? What happened to you? Don't you understand that what you're doing hurts other people or it hurts yourself? It's bad for your health. To understanding with compassion what happened and understanding these natural pathways that are really powerful that lead to the health behaviors and social problems that we want to prevent. So let's take the example of smoking. I noted on that list I just showed you, adverse childhood experience are strongly related to the probability of young kids beginning to smoke and continuing to smoke, and then as adults continuing to smoke, and therefore the risk of lung disease and cancer. Is that because they didn't go to health, they skipped health class? Right? No, is it? They don't know. Try to find somebody in our culture that doesn't know that cigarette smoke, if you keep inhaling it, has carcinogens in it, and it can wreck your lungs and give you heart disease and cardiovascular. Everybody knows that, right? So what's the explanation? This is part of the essence of being trauma-informed. It's an adaptive behavior. Remember, our DNA learns and affects our bodies, and then we adapt to the effects they have in a way that works for us. Smoking works. People that have adverse childhood experiences tend to have more anxiety or more depressive symptoms or have more difficulty concentrating. And when you take in that smoke, what do you get besides carcinogens? You get a neurotransmitter, nicotine. Nicotine is a very powerful neurotransmitter that tends to alleviate depressive symptoms and anxiety and can help people to concentrate. So those kids, as a group that have more ACEs, when they experiment, they're more likely to continue because probably, I believe, subconsciously, things get subtly better, or maybe not so subtly better, and so they're the ones that are more likely to continue and smoke. It's adaptive. We adapt to our experience. Now, I try to be careful. I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about what I believe, because there's a lot of powerful data here, and there's a lot of science that other people are bringing to this. The neuroscientists and the epigenetic people are bringing the science to this. I'm going to talk about my beliefs for a few minutes. I've started reading some philosophy and theology, so I'm a real amateur, okay? So if anybody's really good at this, please forgive me if I butcher it, okay? I learned two important things early on, and they talk about, as human beings, we've talked about our biologic nature. What about our nature, our human nature, as human creatures? Right? You know, we come in here, why are we here today? And why are we embodied here? You know, we're born and we have these bodies and we live. And they say that we are built here, our human nature built us for one very important primary purpose. What are we built for? Sometimes the hand goes up, reproduction. I'm like, well, you know, we're built for that, but that's not actually, you know, that's not part of this. They say we're built for love. We're built to love one another. Is that what? Maybe I think that's what brought us here today, whether you think about it or not, right? We're trying to love one another and do this better. And when there's a lot of adversity, here's my belief, is that it doesn't mean that there's not love, like that family and that dinner table. It doesn't mean there's not love in that family, but it's almost like there's a twist that gets put into it, yeah? A little twist. And so we get hurt biologically, and our human nature gets hurt, because if our primary purpose is to love, and we don't get it in the way we need, we get hurt bad. The second thing they say is that we have minds, and I believe my mind is more than the sum total of all of my nerve cells and neurotransmitters firing off, that it's more than just that. That's my belief about myself. And they say we have minds, and that our minds are built for something really specific. Are our minds built to do calculus or build engineering diagrams like the one I showed at the beginning of the presentation? Our minds are built to seek the truth. Truth, capital T, truth. And I don't know about you, but every once in a while in my life, something will happen. I'll go, that's the truth. You know that feeling like, oh, that's truth. So where there's a lot of adversity and chaos and violence and the kind of problems we're talking about today, maybe there is less experience of that kind of truth in the lives of children and families. And our job is to help bring that to your community, to the Bester community. My job is to take that wherever I go and to teach this so other people can learn it too. So we heal biologically and we get our fundamental human needs met. So I'm going to go through this. This is also my belief of why this information is so powerful. Remember, I'm talking about, there's no graphs here. There's no bar graphs. There's no data. Why is this such powerful information, and why I'm watching? This is spreading so rapidly right now. People are drawn to this. Okay, people are drawn to this. So I'm going to go through this idea of consciousness and that we have minds. And there are three important faculties that our minds have. We have reason. If we're here now, we're using our reason to look at this information and listen and try to learn and teach. We have memory that tells us where our mind and our brain tell us about the past, the story. It's a story. And we have imagination, where we make a story. We don't know what the future is bringing, but we have it in our mind. Right? We think about it. One of the difficulties that we have with our minds is our reason is easily overwhelmed by our memory and our imagination. So for today, we're talking about ACEs and their health and social outcomes. What does our memory do when we have a lot of adversity and some of the consequences of that adversity? It tends to generate shame and fear and a sense of hopelessness. And our imagination can tell us that I'm living in a fixed state. This is how my life is. This pattern is going to continue. I'm afraid, I'm coping, and I may feel hopeless. So what I believe a fundamental aspect of the power of this information is that we can reboot and reframe the conscious way we think about our lives. And use our memory and imagination in a way that reframes and creates a new narrative or story. Because we all need our stories of our lives. And I think the last slide, the story that is embedded that generates shame and fear and hopelessness, and looking forward that says, I'm coping, I'm afraid, this is the way it is a bad narrative. Not bad people, but sort of a wrong narrative. I adapted. I understand. I now have this story of my adversity, and I understand how it works biologically, and I now understand that I'm a really adaptive creature. And congratulate me for adapting in the way I did, because I did what I had to do to get along. It's not my fault. These are essential elements of that bad narrative that when children grow up under these circumstances, they tend to move forward in time and believe that it's their fault. It's not. I'm not alone. I believe when we present this to audiences that the people that have experienced a lot of adversity suddenly realize there's probably a lot of people like me sitting in this room, right? I'm not the only one that had this, and now I understand it better. And I'm good. I'm a divine creation. And then the reboot is I can create new patterns. I believe this enables and empowers people to say, now I get it. I can start writing, almost like pulling out a book and writing a new chapter. I can create new patterns, and I can find hope, meaning, and purpose based upon my experience. I can use that experience. Now, and this is another one I believe is we don't waste the suffering. Use the suffering to say, oh, now I understand, I can create my new narrative, and I can find meaning and purpose in my life and hope and truth and love in taking this to other people and helping them because I get it. And I also believe that's why this is spreading. So it's really remarkable when I travel the country how many people are taking this information in. It's almost supernatural. It's spreading so fast. I seek truth. I'm getting more of it. And I'm learning to love. And I'm being loved in a way that meets my human needs that I hadn't had before. So I believe that this whole idea of rewriting the narrative provides a chance to see the story of your life and the lives of people around you, to create a different path for the future that moves us from shame and confusion and the adaptations that have a downside, to create a different path for the future with hope, meaning, and purpose. And I believe that can be done on a community-wide scale. I've seen communities change and begin to heal. The best examples come from the state of Washington, where I traveled for 10 years, and where they've been doing these communities, like your community of hope here, they've been doing this, teaching this over and over and over for more than a decade. And the people in the community and the people in the systems that provide human services, begin to change the way they think, and they change the way they do things. And healing occurs. And different programs and policies emerge. And people in the community have been affected by ACEs get engaged and find hope, meaning, purpose in taking the healing to the people around them. So here's this idea of self-healing communities. Oh, I have more time than I thought. I have time to tell a story. Can I tell a story? Okay. Oh, wait, no, I don't. Sorry. I need to go through this. I got ahead of myself. Let's go to, I've been talking about this, and my belief, this is where the power of change is generated. It's the biggest, most powerful gear. And we tend to say, look at people that know how to fix things as where the power is. I think the power is here. So let's look at healthcare. How does this play out in healthcare? Pharmacy. The leading driver of inflation in healthcare is the cost of pharmaceuticals. So we looked at the ACE score, and we followed people forward in time. We got all the prescriptions from the Kaiser administrative data over a 7-year period for those 17,000 people. There were more than 1 million prescriptions in our database. I mean, you almost never get that kind of information. 1 million? Really? 1 million prescriptions. This is prescriptions for antidepressants. And here's the familiar higher ACE scores, more and more something, in this case, more and more prescriptions for antidepressants. We estimate that half of the antidepressant medications have their origins in the experiences of childhood that we call adversity, half of them. And then we said, well, what about multiple kinds of drugs? The formulary has 15 classes of drugs, for heart disease, respiratory disease, all these different treatments, pain, sleep, cancer, 15 classes of drugs. And we said, how many classes of drugs do people get based upon their ACE scores? Here is receiving 8 or more classes of those 15 drugs over a 7-year period among relatively young people, 18 to 44-year-old people. 10% to 25%. In 7 years, for ACE scores of 5 or more, 1 in 4 people had received 8 or more of those 15 different classes of drugs in the Kaiser formulary. Now, some of those are probably effective, some of those aren't, and part of what's happening in healthcare is to say, what is really going on here and what is really needed? And it's not to blame any healthcare providers, anybody, to sort this out a little better and say, what are we treating? And can we treat it better? Is 8 or more classes of drugs the effective treatment for what's in front of me? Or do I need to know the story better so that I can sort it out? The education system. Here is what I want to talk about, this information taken into community. This was taken in to Spokane, Washington by Dr. Chris Blodgett at Washington State University, and he went into the elementary school system because that community had seen this data for years, and so the people in the education system were not afraid, right? Their fear dropped. They weren't afraid to let him go into the schools and find out what the ACE scores of elementary school students were by asking, not them, but asking about the adults that work with them or the parents. And he found that students with 3 or more ACEs are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade. They score lower on standardized tests. They have more language difficulties. They're suspended or expelled more. They're designated as special education more frequently, and they tend to have poor health. Here is, I think, a really ingenious slide from the Washington Family Policy Council that's did this work for many years. This is a classroom with 30 students in it, based upon their surveys of students. There's 30 students here. I don't know if you can see the numbers on the desks. Those are a statistically representative classroom. In those 30 students, there are 6 with no ACEs, 5 with 1, 6 with 2, 3 with 3, 7 with 4 or 5, and 3 with 6 or more ACEs. Were our schools built with the understanding of the effect of ACEs on neurodevelopment and social, emotional, and cognitive functioning and language acquisition and all the things that we ask students to do in school? I'm not blaming, it wasn't there. So the majority of kids in every classroom, and this would be, anywhere you do this, you would see something like this. Anywhere here or any other place in the US, you would see something like this in every classroom. So what my belief is, when we talk about trauma-informed schools or trauma-sensitive schools, is we're talking about the adaptations that children bring into the classroom. We need to begin to say, do we expect the children to adapt to the needs of the expectations of society in the school, or do we adapt the school to the needs of the children so they can succeed in school? That's the tension and dynamic. Where does the adaptation come from? Those are adaptive kids no matter where they're what the number is on their desk, right? Our DNA learns we're really adaptive creatures, and we get ourselves ready for the environments that we live in. So do we try to make them do it differently, or do we do differently for them so they can succeed? The justice system, or the prison pipeline. I want to show you this just because it's so striking to me, and you probably know this, but this is the number of incarcerated Americans from 1920 to 2014 here on the far right. And we'll just look at the red for now. This is the number of Americans imprisoned. It's about, I think, 150, 200,000 here. And then you see this rapid increase in the 80s to almost 2.5 million here. Our country incarcerates more people per capita than any other country in the world. Where do most of these people come from? What puts them at risk for interaction with the justice system? Here's another application of the ACE study data in Pierce County, Washington. There was a young woman named Julie Grevstad who I met at a meeting, and she worked with the kids in juvenile justice. And she loved those kids. She said, can we find out what the ACE scores on these kids in the juvie justice system? And so they had a database, a standard database that had a lot of the ACE-type questions in it. So we created ACE scores for these kids. And here's the ACE score for these kids. The height of these bars in those kids that are on probation in Pierce County, Washington, the height of these gray bars is a history of 7 or more suspensions or expulsions since the 1st grade. 7 or more. So you have the adversity, you have these adaptations that conflict with society's expectations and needs, and you go to school in first grade and you get thrown out. Where do you go? Where do you go? So what does this lead to? We're talking about the prison pipeline. And again, I'm not here to criticize schools or physicians or anybody in the system. But we now know that doing this makes it worse. Makes it worse. So one of the key things that I see happening in our culture is when this data gets out, is people begin to look at how they're doing things, understand, and they see the things that they can stop doing that are further traumatizing to people that have had a lot of trauma. So suspension expulsion is one of those. Here's the risk of felony reoffense for those kids according to their ACE score, which is now not surprising. It's 12% in the first year here to 23%, and here's the second year. As the ACE scores go, the risk of felony reoffense doubles, and therefore entry into the adult prison system. So here on the far right is a table. Just see these numbers. They're all right around 70%. These are different studies around the country that show that on average, 70% of kids in the juvie justice system have a diagnosable mental health disorder. 70%. And of those with mental health disorders, almost 3/4 have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder. Remember the graphs on substance abuse and mental health? The pipeline, the experiential pipeline into these things that lead to the justice system. Half of the kids in our country, on average, have both a diagnosable mental health and substance abuse disorder if they're in the justice system, in the juvie justice system. And the data look very similar for surveys in the adult prison systems. Poverty. I'm frequently asked about poverty. Now, poverty is something complex, so I can't tell you, what are all the causes and consequences of poverty, but I also believe that ACEs are part of the pathway into poverty and part of what sustains poverty. A pathway in and, I believe, a sustainer of poverty. This is not from the ACE study. This is from state surveys from 5 states several years ago, about 4 years ago, where you see the ACE score going up here. This is unemployment, percentage of people in those states that are unemployed, and this is unable to work because of mental or physical issues in their lives. If you add up those 2 points there, 1 in 4 people with ACE scores of 4 or more are either unemployed or unable to work. So is unemployment is it random? No, probably not. Here is residential mobility. This goes back to the ACE study. We asked people, how many times did you change residences, even within the same town? Change residences while you were growing up to age 18. This is moving more than 8 times in the first 18 years of life, from about 6% to 25% for higher ACE scores. So we think about, start putting these things together, because these things tend to, I show the graphs one by one, they tend to co-occur in the lives of children and families. So you have these other issues, you have residential mobility, you move from one school to the next. If you have supportive, caring people in your environment, that you tend to move on and try to find another one. You go to a different school where things are done differently, where they may speak a different language, language that you don't know, or you have language acquisition difficulties. So residential mobility, at high levels of ACEs, the families become almost nomadic. And we have social workers here that can probably tell you what that's like, trying to work with and sustain support for people that are moving around a lot. Here's homelessness. This is from the state of Washington. What is the primary driver, preventable pathway to homelessness? It's all these things that accumulate that I've shown you that end up here to a 25% chance of being homeless at least once for ACE scores of 6 or more. So ACEs are the common source for many things: mental illness, addiction, domestic violence, disrupted families and relationships, suicide, chronic illnesses, school failure, depends where you want to put the quotes, crime or mass incarceration, poverty, homelessness, health disparities, why some groups of people have more health and social problems than others, the health disparities issue, and violence. Here is, I've talked about risk. The bar graphs where one bar goes higher than another, so that shows you one level of how the risk increases. There's another kind of risk that's really important here. This is called population attributable risk. And what that is simply is not the risk of a problem, but what percentage of a health or social problem is caused by the adversities. As it piles up, what percentage of that problem? And this represents an oil slick here. This was done when the BP oil well blew up. And a really clever woman in the state of Washington took my presentation on this, said, "Nobody understands it, Rob. Let me make a slide for you that people will try to understand better." So you imagine the oil pouring out here. So this is the contamination of the human ecosystem, if you will, by adverse childhood experiences. We estimate that more than half of depression is caused by ACEs, half of disability, half of domestic violence, almost half of promiscuity and high-risk sexual behaviors, almost 80% of IV drug abuse, 2/3 of alcoholism, 60% of suicides, and we talked about hopelessness, almost half of hopelessness in human populations. So the oil slick is dark. Does it bum you out? I'm a prevention guy. I see an oil slick that big and say, if ACEs cause 50 to 80% of our major health and social problems, and we can prevent ACEs, we can shrink the slick. So if you imagine, put your finger in the center there. This is reducing the intergenerational cycle of ACEs. Not only will these one by one be reduced, but they will all be reduced simultaneously. And I think that's one of the things that brings people together from different services and with different funding streams and say, I may believe I have the most important issue in the world and my funding stream funds the best program in the world, and it's probably a good one, but why don't we do it together? Because when you succeed, I succeed. And I see that happening in meetings where people who normally would fight over their budgets and won't want to talk to each other because they're threatening to each other, they're beginning to say, wow, if I win, you win. And it brings people together in terms of funding and systems and services. The power of the ACE study is it provides a common language. It's important. This is a social movement, I see, and people that study social movements say you have to have a common language, and it turns out we got lucky by calling this the ACE study. People will use that term. They'll talk about ACEs and ACE scores. And a common conceptual framework so that when that language is used, when people are talking to each other, they're talking about the same thing. And I don't think this conceptual framework is really all that difficult to understand. The people will use the language and they're talking about the same thing, they're thinking the same things. We learned that ACEs are common, they're highly interrelated. They pile up and have a cumulative impact, a biologic impact that we now understand better and will understand more in the future. And they account for a large percentage, often a majority, of the major health and social problems that we face today. Therefore, we can prevent them. It's highly preventable. And the biologic plausibility helps generate compassion, and I believe in the future will help us to design better ways of dealing with adverse childhood experiences. So self-healing communities. I told you when I started that some people thought that I was a utopian fool talking about a self-healing community. I'm going to show you a video that I believe is an example of what happens in a self-healing community. About 7 years ago, I was in a community center in Walla Walla, Washington, and did an evening presentation, much like this one. And at the end of my presentation, I was holding a microphone, and a woman came up and ripped the microphone out of my hand and started talking. And at that point, I checked out. I freaked out. I've never had anybody do that at a presentation. So I don't remember what this woman said. About 4 years later, I was at a meeting in Canada, and the woman who made that oil slick graph was there. Let's go over to the beginning. And she said, "Do you know Annette?" I said, "No, who's Annette?" "Well, Annette's the woman who ripped the microphone out of your hand in Walla Walla, Washington." "Oh, okay, I remember that." Well, so we have a video of Annette. And the only thing that I want to say before I show you this is she talks about taking the ACEs test. I sometimes hand out a one-page, I call it Finding Your ACE score, that people can fill out in about 5 minutes so they can get their own ACE score, and she had done that.
I was invited to the conference or the meeting out at the college, and I came not really knowing and not really understanding the whole thing, but I wanted my sister came along with me also. And he started going through all the questions and about your childhood and how it affected the way you are today and things like that. And my sister and I both sat there and we filled out the paper, and it said to take the ACEs test and stuff. And we could say yes. You say yes or no to the questions, and we could say yes to all 10 of the questions. And I thought, I can't, I'm tired of, my life is just going nowhere or anything, and I'm tired of just being nobody. I have to do something about it, and something happened. And I just was like, I woke up and realized that nobody's going to change you and nobody's going to do anything for you. You have to be willing to change and do something for yourself. I've had so much negative in my life and not hardly any positive. And so I went through the motions, with my kids and trying to parent them the best I knew. I went through the motions of going to the school meetings and showing up and another one, and, over and over and over. But now it's more of, I'm in the middle of it. I'm involved. I'm a part of, and they're listening to me. They know, when I want something for my son, they know where it's coming from. The saying, it takes a village to raise a child. That's my favorite saying in the world, because my village came together. After the ACEs presentation was when it was like a wake-up call to me. It was time for me my life was not going anywhere. It's time for me to wake up and stop being the victim and start being a role model, start being a human. I feel like I can live now. I'm out of my shell. I don't have to hide. I don't have to be the victim. If I'm going to help my son, I have to help myself first. You have to want to wake up. You have to want to change. And I wanted more for my children than what I had.
Just very quickly, we're almost. I want to say a couple of things about this. This is why I believe in what I'm doing, and it keeps me going out teaching this and doing this. She was homeless, living in her car with her 2 sons when she came to that meeting and took the microphone from me. And she said a few really important things that make me believe in that whole idea of this conscious reframing. She said she wanted to be human. Is that shame? She didn't feel like she was human. And she made some changes. What did she do? She changed the way she parented her sons. She became more available to them. And she was this happened in the context of community, because there was someone in that community who knew her enough to say, maybe you should go to this presentation. That person afterwards became an emotion coach for her to help her regulate her emotions. And in terms of of taking the healing, taking meaning and purpose, and taking the healing forward. She now has her own small foundation in Walla Walla, Washington, to help homeless people get on their feet. So a homeless person living in her car became a healer in her community. That's why I believe in the power of that biggest gear, the people affected by adversity, engaging them so that they can get involved in the service community or interact with the service communities in a way that has synergy. And it's also, I believe, sustainable, like what you're doing here. It's sustainable and low cost. So I'm gonna end there. Thank you for coming this morning.
So thanks to Dr. Anda, we are going to take about a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, what we're going to do is spend some time with panelists from the community, not only from Washington County, but also from the state, and have some discussions about things that people are currently trying. So take a break, bathrooms, snacks. See you in about 10 minutes. All right, so what we have done over the past 3 to 4 years now with the work in the Bester Community of Hope is we've used these trainings as opportunities to create a conversation in the community. We have not been directive with this work. We've really focused on providing the information and hoping that people will naturally arrive at places where they can think about how this fits within their organization. So in 2016, in the early part of 2016, we brought Dr. Anda's counterpart, Vincent Felitti, and we did a large event at Bester Elementary. This venue's a little better, don't you think? It's a little better? We love your school, Principal English, but I think the venue's a little bit more conducive. And then after the event there, we focused really on making sure we laid out the research and people understood it. We had some folks from the Child Trauma Academy also really provide information, but it was some pretty heavy-duty stuff, it was like a 5-hour science class we had. And so in the fall of that year, we hosted Antietam Academy, Bester Elementary, folks from social services and the faith community, and we had a screening of a film, Paper Tigers, and we talked about when this research is implemented in a school, this is what it looks like. So people could start to make the connection between all of this information and what it looks like when it's implemented in a community. This past March, in this venue here, we had a lot of people show up to meet James Redford, who is the director of the film Resilience. He also directed Paper Tigers. He talked about his experience in a school in the state of Washington. That's what Dr. Anda was talking about for those 10 years that he was over there. And the work and how they were able to, over time, create a trauma-informed school system, specifically at Lincoln Alternative School. And so people came away from that training understanding deeper about ACEs and how different approaches to serving children and families that are either affected by trauma or living in a community that is impacted by trauma, and then it posed more questions. So what we want to do today is move from theory and practices that are happening elsewhere to practices that are happening in our state, in our county, and our neighborhoods here. And so we're really super excited that these awesome folks have agreed to join us today to talk about their work that they're doing at the neighborhood, county, and state level. So if we could just briefly go down the line, starting with Brother Andy, explain your name and what brings you to the work, where you're from.
Good morning, or good afternoon, whatever part of the day we're in. My name is Brother Andy Smith. I'm a part of Brothers United Who Dare to Care. We go by Brothers Who Care. And over the years, we have been trying to be a conduit for information, self-help information, and news that can help serve our community. And that's pretty much what I do besides teach pre-K.
Good morning, everybody.
You're good.
I'll share.
I'm good. My good friend, Brother Andy here, he's helping out. Thank you very much. I'm Victor Breed. I'm the Chief of Police in the City of Hagerstown.
Maybe your
doesn't work.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
There you go. Don't expect me to sing, please. Good policing is about partnerships. Police in themselves cannot do everything that we need to have done in our communities. And I can say right now to my right, Brother Andy, not only is he a friend, but he's an incredible partner. To my left, Delegate Wilson is equally engaged in the communities everywhere. He's a great partner in our community, a great partner with the police department in everything that we do. But good, solid policing involves, as the video said, a village, everybody involved in getting things done. Tim Morrow, principal of Antietam Academy, an incredible partner for us in some of the things we do in our community to help people and to extend that conversation and communication that we have. So I'm proud to be here. Thank you very, very much. And I recognize quite a few people in the audience, but thank you.
As the chief said, my name is Brett Wilson. I'm a state delegate. For the last 3 years, I've represented Hagerstown in General Assembly down in Annapolis. And really, the path that led me here really started when I joined the state's attorney's office here in Washington County back in 2002. Without going into too much detail, the experience I had working with the Narcotics Task Force, being hands-on involved in the community, going to the homes that were blighted by drug addiction, seeing the abuses of children, the abuses of adults, the abuses of system, really started me on the conscious trip to get more involved in the community as we went along, which at some point, and as you've all experienced in life, there comes a time when you just decide it's time to do X or do Y. And a few years ago, my family and I decided it was time to run for office and try to really make a difference. And I'm sure we'll get into more of what we've been doing in Annapolis to try and make the world better for a lot of these kids that are stuck in a cycle of abuse, cycle of addiction, cycle of trauma. And I'll be glad to talk about that, but that's essentially why I'm here today.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Jones-Gaston, and I'm Executive Director with Social Services Administration at the Department of Human Services, and have the great pleasure of working directly with Mike Piercy and his team at Washington County's Department of Social Services, and am excited to be playing a role in integrating what we're learning through ACEs and trauma-informed practice and integrating that across the state in all of the work that we do. And I had, before landing in the seat that I'm in, spent 10 years at Casey Family Programs, so have some history in understanding how this work has really evolved across the community here. And so I'm excited to play a different role in continuing to advance that effort.
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Holcomb. I'm an 8th grade science teacher at Western Heights Elementary School. I mean, elementary. They just act like that. No, they're middle schools, middle schoolers. And I'm really excited to share what I've learned as an educator over the years, the necessity for all educational arms of the county to become trauma-informed, the imperativeness of all of our teachers to become resiliency trained. And that's the only way I see that we, as an educational branch, can effectively help transform the lives of our students.
Can we just give all these people a huge round of applause? So I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Anda in a second. Just one important point that I wanted to make in relation to the trainings that we've been doing, the conversations that we're about to have. Being trauma-informed does not remove us from having accountability for kids. It does not remove us from having accountability for families that we work with and the communities that we're in. Being trauma-informed means we have greater insight and understanding, and thus have the compassion to work with these groups that we're working with. And then we will be more adaptive and creative in the response that we have, because we know that there can be a better result as a part of that process. Okay? Dr. Anda, off to you.
I'd like to keep this open as possible at the beginning. In terms of what we're here today talking about, the concepts, is there anything that really stands out about how it applies to what you're doing, or the issues that you see that you might think about addressing differently, or try to teach in the system within the system that you work in?
Well, Dr. Anda, I'll break the ice, I guess, on that one. And obviously, everything that you presented this morning is exactly what a legislative body is supposed to be working on, right? You know, it's our job to try and improve the quality of life for every citizen and every resident within our jurisdictions. And when the factors that you put up when you're looking at your ACE analysis, obviously, substance abuse. Well, you know, we've been working significantly on substance abuse, all substances, particularly right now, the opioid crisis. As we know, that's the number one most deadliest of the substance abuse issues right now. But when we start discussing these items in Annapolis and we hear the stories from all around the state, what we hear are the similarities in family consequences and the breakdown of the family, usually caused by a substance abuse issue and you know, physically abusive relationship within the family household. And what we've done, you know, just most recently is try to address those through, and I'll just list a couple acts without going into detail, but this past year, the HOPE Act, the Let's Start Talking Act. We did Justice Reinvestment 2 years ago because we recognized that on the tail end, if you're going to break a cycle, you need to address those people that perhaps have caused the trauma and try to help them reintegrate without causing more trauma and actually with being beneficial to the redevelopment of the folks that were traumatized the first time. We look locally at the Day Reporting Center and JSAP and Tamar. You know, our county, everyone should be proud, our county on the criminal justice side has been at the forefront of addressing these issues as they've been recognized and taught to us by the professionals doing the research. And you know, when I saw your presentation and I saw you go down the list by percentages, like, yeah, I mean, that is what my job is to address, to try and give us a chance to get these kids out of these cycles.
Thank you.
So what I guess, for me, when I first started hearing about the ACEs study and brain science many years ago, I'm a social worker by training. And I was thinking, holy crap, what have I been doing up until now in working with families and kids? And it was an amazing eye-opener in regards to, we've been doing a lot of things, not necessarily wrong, but there's so much opportunity for us to do it better. And you know, our role in social services really is, we're intervening in a capacity because there's something that's happened, be it with a child, be it with a vulnerable adult. And the lens that the ACEs study brings, that trauma-informed practice brings, allows us to come into that engagement at a point of crisis differently, to engage with the parents differently, but also the important piece, I mean, I think the thing that's thrilling for me is the opportunity about breaking generational cycles. Because it is terrifying a little bit to know what the impact of those experiences have on generation after generation. And one of our key roles really is kind of working in the now, but also with the eye on what is coming tomorrow and how can we impact better outcomes for the communities that we're serving.
I want to tell you a little story. My first year teaching at Western Heights. If you don't know Western Heights, we're 70% farm school, Title I. The nickname is Western Fights. And my colleague came to me and she said, man, I had this boy come into my class and he came unprepared and he needed a pencil, so I gave him one of my pencils, and during the course of my lesson, he just starts breaking his pencil. And then he starts throwing his pencil across the room. And I looked at him and I said, what are you doing? That's my pencil. I was nice enough to give it to you when you came to class unprepared. What are you doing? And he looks at her and he says, I just watched my dad beat up my mother for hours. Police came, they arrest my dad. I don't care about your pencil. And she looked at me and she's like, he's right. He shouldn't be caring about his pencil. And this happens all the time. Our children don't articulate the reason behind the symptoms they're exhibiting. And I had an administrator come to me and say, Well, if only your lesson plans were more dynamic, you capture these kids. Now, I try to be as dynamic as I can be. I make little hydrogen bombs. I light things on fire all the time. But when some girl's been molested by mom's boyfriend all night, she came to school nonetheless because that is the safe place. I don't care how good I am as a teacher. She's in trauma. She has adrenaline and cortisol filling her brain. She literally can't learn. And unless we address that aspect, that these aren't bad kids, these are symptomatic kids. And when they walk into my classroom, now I'm looking for the symptoms. And now when I can see the kid, and we all know someone who's having a bad day. It's written all over. Kids can't conceal anything. Certainly a 14-year-old can't. It's all out there. And so before class starts, if that teacher can go up and say, wow, you look so mad. Is everything okay? And usually the kid will, is there anything I can do? And they really don't want you to do anything. They'll say, no. Okay, do you need to take a break? No. Okay, well look, I'm gonna start class, but hey, I know you're having a bad day. If you wanna take 5 minutes and go out in the hall, get some water, you have my permission. You know I'm here, right? Yeah, okay. That was a 30-second conversation that any teacher can have. And what I just did was I just allowed that kid permission to feel the way they do. I offered them an out if they need one. And most importantly, I let them know, you know what, there's someone here that cares. I think as educators, we fear to do that. We fear to get drawn in. I can't solve that kid's problem. The kid doesn't want you to solve their problem. They don't. They just want you to be there. They want to know someone's there and that they're safe. So that's I'll stop. That's something we're trying to do.
Yeah. Anybody else? That one? Yeah, thank you. I'm going to offer this up as a sort of a two-part opening is changes that you see happening in the work that you do that may be related to this topic, and or what are the kind of barriers that you run into? What are the things that are in the way of changes that you like to see? So it's really a two-part question. Changes you've made or things that get in the way, what are the obstacles?
Well, in the work that I do in the community and also in the classroom, one of the biggest barriers or obstacles can be ourselves. I don't have the advantage of knowing what presentation you gave here earlier because I had just showed up. But I'm here, one, because of what was said, healing communities. Communities do need to be healed. Also, communities need to be connected. And ourselves is one of the biggest barriers I can see is that sometimes the people that we're trying to help didn't choose to be there. And the number one thing that we need to have is respect for their humanity. I don't think anyone would pick to be poor. Most of us know after what happened in 2008, we're all 1 or 2 paychecks away from being homeless. So our situations can change at any time, but our humanity allows us to survive it. And having respect for the people that we're trying to help, like the relationship that I've built with the chief here was, he reached out to me, we sort of made a connection. We set aside our agendas and the work that we wanted to do and got a chance to know each other and respect and care for each other and appreciate our humanity. And that allows us to be able to do what we can to help one another. If I allowed any of my prejudices, my culture, or circumstances going on around me to not give him a chance because he's a police officer, I wouldn't have been able to develop the relationship that we have and enjoy. The children that I try to teach, I will tell you I'm not the best in teaching academics, but I am the best in trying to make sure that that child's learning experience is one that they love, that they know they can learn, that they know that they cared about. I see the students come by, I don't know 80-something of them's names, but I always try to tell the girls, how are you doing today, pretty girl? How you doing today, guy? You may be having a bad day, but I want to care about the person, the individual, more than the agenda, what we're trying to achieve. I'm trying to make that connection that maybe they will trust and care enough about what I'm trying to offer to use it at some point. You know, but we can be the biggest barrier. And it can come from even personal hang-ups. I mean, we go out and do home visits in people's homes, and, you know, there's times I may not want to sit on a chair that doesn't look like one that I like, but what am I there for? What am I here for? I have to set aside my prejudices, my fears, and actually want to do what it is that I have the opportunity and the chance to do, make a connection, and hopefully make somebody better than they were when I found them.
Thank you. Thank you.
My good friend here, we met about 15 months ago. He's family now. And that started with effective communication. And when you look at barriers that we have, usually all the root cause of a lot of challenges we have are the lack of communication or ineffective communication. When you see a police officer every day, you know, the visual, uniform, a duty belt around their waist, firearm, taser, handcuffs, radio, a variety of different equipment, thousands of dollars around their waist to protect you and others and the officer. The most important tool a police officer has is his or her mouth, the ability to communicate. If you don't communicate effectively, especially in our role, it's for naught. Effective communication is the lifeblood of good policing. It's very, very important in how we treat people with respect and dignity in all of our interactions. Every situation is different. You know, being an effective communicator does not make us soft or weak. It makes us more effective. It makes us stronger in how we do things. And I want to tell you just a brief little story. I was fortunate. I didn't spend most of my career, I spent all my adult life with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington. I was fortunate to have great mentors as I moved up to the chain of command. The best chief I ever had that I worked directly for was Chief Charles Ramsey. Some of you may know him. A mentor, a father figure to me. I worked directly for him for the last 2 years he was on the job. But he told us a story, which is very important about effective policing. He said, and Chief Ramsey, again, when he came to D.C., he wasn't a D.C. guy. He came from Chicago. He spent 30 years at a command level, the Chicago PD. But he talked to us at command staff meetings, but he told us a story. And the story was this: as a young narcotics sergeant, he had an opportunity to go into a lot of houses on warrants with a lot of his team, his other detectives. Oftentimes, those were fairly violent encounters. You'd go in, he'd say they'd go in with a sledgehammer, but he had one detective that was able to navigate that. And every warrant that they served when they went into a home, he was able to calm everything down. And Ramsey saw that over and over again. So finally one day, he pulled the detective aside and he says, "How do you do that? It's magical." He goes, "It's not magic, Chief." He goes, "Remember one thing. In life, you get 10 points. Take 3 points right off the top of that 10, because no one is born into a perfect situation, rich, poor, and otherwise." He says, "Take another 3 points off that 7, because you're born into a family situation that maybe there's no loving, no nurturing, no mother, no father. There's alcohol abuse, maybe sexual abuse. There's all sorts of dysfunction in that family. That leaves you 4 points. Take 3 more points off that 4, because you're born possibly into a marginalized community that the history of policing has not touched those folks, and it's negative. If you're true to yourself, you understand that the history of policing in this country is not all perfect. And you recognize that. That leaves 1 point. That 1 point is that person's dignity and respect. If you take that away from anybody, they'll fight you every time. So always remember that. And that stuck with me. And that's the way we have to police. Because it doesn't matter what you have. Everyone has dignity and respect. So that's incredibly important. So that's what I want to say.
So one of the charges of being at state central office is that we're the ones that develop the policies that our good partners in the local departments are to follow. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do intentionally is take our family-centered, strength-based practice that's been going on successfully across the state and weave intentionally trauma-informed practice into that, and creating a practice model so that when you go to Worcester County or to Washington County or to Harford County, when you're talking about practice and what the values are and how we commit to engaging with the communities that we're serving, it's the same. And then you've got the local nuances and twists and community partnerships, but that's really what we're trying to do at the state level. The state has done a fantastic job of trying to minimize trauma by keeping kids in their homes. So since 2007, we've reduced the number of kids in foster care across the state by 54%. That's fantastic. And we're one of 2 states in the country that have been able to sustain the decline in use of foster care. So that's one really exciting thing that we're committed to continue to do. But what that means is our skills of working with families with their children in the home have to be that much better so that we're able to ensure that kids are safe, first of all, but also that the family is well and able to take care of each other and grow. And you think about adult services. The number one phone call that we get for adult protective services has to do with self-neglect. And I can't help but think that a lot of that shows up on the slides that we saw today of the substance use, the mental health challenges, all those sort of things that kind of combine together to make it really hard to want to take care of yourself or know how to take care of yourself. And so with a practice model that spans across our entire community, being committed to doing those things well and better and continuing to push ourselves to not just get into the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So what if the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? Where else are we getting more apples? We have to be able to nurture our communities. And the next thing that I'd share, just in thinking about, I saw a lot of myself in the story of ACEs, and I won't ask folks to raise their hand, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of folks in this room saw a lot of themselves in the conversation around adverse childhood experiences. And so what does that mean for me as a worker? And how I'm going into situations that may be very reminiscent to an experience that I had. And how am I going to, A, not bring that to the table with the people I'm serving, but how am I going to take care of myself? And that secondary trauma, that trauma that we bring with us, a lot of reasons why we get into the work that we do is connected to trauma we've experienced. And so the state has been really committed to investing in taking care of our workforce and figuring out and finding new and different ways for us to be better at what we're doing and taking care of ourselves so that we're better in serving the community. And we're doing it a lot in partnership with our good partners in the legislation.
Sure, and let me just add to that, one of the initiatives that we believe will bear very good fruit is called the 3BI initiative, which is the 3 Branches Institute. And basically that brings together judicial, executive, and legislative into a room on a regular basis to try and coordinate responses to community issues. You know, our system is set up on checks and balances, right? We've got the different branches so that one doesn't have too much power in that, and that's all kind of a negative power to keep things in line. But what it doesn't bar, and I don't think we've effectively used it, is that we can also work together on issues to try and make community better. So the 3 Branches Institute initiative is bringing all those branches together in a room with the experiences of people from each of those different endeavors, trying to figure ways that we can actually resolve these issues and provide wraparound services to the family at an early stage without having to go from spot to spot to spot. When you talk about hindrances to development, the two biggest ones, institutional knowledge and institutional siloing. Because knowledge, if we think we know it, guess what? We're not learning what's really going on. And if we live in a silo, we're not cooperating with other agencies, other people that also have a piece of that pie. Life is a Venn diagram. It's not a bunch of columns. And sometimes, and it's easy to do over time, and we all have heard jokes about government bureaucracy, but it's true. If you're doing the same thing long enough, quite frankly, that's how you're going to do it tomorrow also. And we don't take the time to really investigate, to learn about what is changing in our communities and trying to address that instead of addressing it like we would have a year ago, trying to address it now with whatever new techniques we've learned will work. The best practices model is certainly one that we want to put in across the state, but we don't want to put it in a manner of one size fits all. I mean, one size doesn't fit all from household to household, let alone from one county to another. So it's important that we keep that type of flexibility with the professionals that are on the ground. We just give them the tools to do the job better. But they have to make that initial identification, take in that data, and process what's going to be best to break that particular household out of the cycle that it's trapped in. And that's what we're trying to do.
So when I want to know how my students are doing, one of the things I can do is I can give them a test. That's easy. When they want to know how a school is doing or how a county is doing, then we're going to give high-stakes tests. And I understand that we need some rubric to assess our schools. But I'm not a test teacher, and I'm not real thrilled with the level of importance these high-stakes tests have put. And here's the detriment and the barrier to what's happening. So Washington County, if you didn't know, did not do well. We dropped almost across the board on this test. And so the principals get called in, and they get talked to very sternly. And the principals come back to the teachers because, ultimately it's our fault. We get talked to very sternly. And then it's, well, what are you doing wrong in the classroom? What are you going to do to fix this? Now, I am always, every day, looking for a way to become a better teacher. I really am, and all of my colleagues are. And I'm so thrilled to work with the best educational professionals I've ever seen in Washington County. They really are phenomenal. I want us to look a different direction. Like I said, maybe that it's not that we don't know our reading strategies, and it's not that we don't know our pedagogy. Maybe there's something more. And maybe we need to put as much emphasis in this direction. So I know that has worked for me in my classroom. So the first day of school, I'm not doing anything other than trying to get those kids to know about me. And I tell them my job the first day is to get you to buy into me. Because I know if you can't buy into me and why I'm going to ask you to do things a certain way, then I've lost you the whole year. But if I can sell myself to you, then I've got you. And I know that if I can get their buy-in, then I do have them the rest of the year. But my principal walked in as I'm telling these personal stories and capturing their hearts. And there goes an email. Remember, we only have 180 days. You should be jumping right into your curriculum, And so I teach different kids on different days. So even day 2 of school this week, I had brand new kids. So there I am, selling myself in my infomercial. And the superintendent now walks through my class. And I get another email. Remember, it's really critical. We jump right into our curriculum. And I thought, no. It's really critical that they know that this is a safe place to learn, and you can trust me. That's what's critical, not me doing anything. Thank you. So if I had any influence in the educational department, it would be we need a balance. We need a balance because there's a reason why our scores have flat. If that's where you want to look at scores. There's a reason why we have flatlined in the best of schools, in the best of neighborhoods. And so maybe it's not the teaching branch we need to improve. Maybe it's addressing, everything we learned up there, because that's how we can help their minds heal and get those test scores up if that's what's important to us. So.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in because she pointed out something that's very important, that it also helps to remove a barrier. I know in about the 20 years that I've been doing this outreach work for the community, that along the way, and I see familiar faces in this room with people that are out there keeping boots on the ground, doing what we're trying to do to reach people. And we're almost like a tool in the toolbox. So you never know you need it until that particular job comes up that calls for us. And building credibility, even with the 15 months that the chief's been here in our community. When I'm out in the community, I see Brett, I see Tammy sitting over there. I see faces that are always, ground level to what's going on. And I think we honestly want to be there to help, but also to have that credibility. Because I take for granted some of the credibility that I have, but down in the Jonathan Street community where our news publication gave birth, that now actually reaches into 4 states and does a little international work now, I can go up on someone's doorstep any time of the day, even at night, and they'll never question why I'm there. Because at least once a month, myself or one of the people that still deliver a hard copy of our news publication to those homes, they get that. They know why we're there. I've seen other groups come out maybe once a year or whatever to do something, and people question, what do they want? And I guess when you get that credibility that nobody is questioning why you're there, that gives you an advantage to be useful for whatever model it is that we're using to be successful in the service that we're providing. And I would say this to you, take that chance to be consistent. I do a thing, I'm wearing some colors up here that some of you may have noticed. One is my tribe, and it's sort of like a Garveyite, red, black, and green, the blood, the people, the land, or the life, the people, the motherland. And the other one is humanity. A couple years ago, I started doing this thing where I get these bracelets away, and it's not Maryland colors, but it's helpful. It's red, yellow, black, and white, and brown, and it represents the human family. And I give the notion that together looks nice. It really does. And also with people. Together, we can do great things together. And I sort of give these bracelets away. I just make them, and my idea is that one day I'll walk in a room and I always see somebody wearing one of them. And for all else that I do, this is one thing that I like, and I keep doing it, I keep doing it, I keep doing it. There's celebrities that wear them now. In the music industry, we do a lot of cultural coverage, and they're wearing them. They get it, and it's just something I consistently do, and it kind of builds credibility that I really believe in everyone coming together and doing something right. So for what you're doing, you built your credibility with me.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes. Why don't we move towards trying to get some interaction here? Either if you have questions for me or for the panel, or if you'd like to share what you might be doing, your experience. We have a microphone.
So who's first, right? That's what it always boils down to. Oh, here we go. Miss Marshall. You have to stand up.
Well, I want to just thank the Western Heights area. In my line of work, rarely does a school call me and say, "Can you come in? We got a concern about your child." And it was one of the newer experiences I had with systems. The silos. We broke down some silos. You invited us in, you invited other people in, and we tried to help one child. And I can tell you, he is succeeding now, he's thriving. So I think what we recognize is trauma happens in relationships, and it can only be healed in a relationship. So I think the schools are awesome.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a clinical social worker. I work in Montgomery County. I do in school and in-home mental health. I wanted to speak to the educational side of things. My wife is a teacher. 85% of her school is free and reduced lunch. They are Title I. My mother is a teacher. She teaches school community-based, trying to help kids with disabilities integrate in the community. My wife's mother was an administrator, and her aunt was a principal. My father and my brother in Montgomery County work in the planning department, so we are a family of public servants. So we understand the issues you guys deal with. I wanted to say thank you to you, because I know what it's like to be in the side of things where there is very little recognition. And in today's society and culture, things have become very difficult. And I feel like in schools, that is the one place we have to reach children, point blank, period. And there's been a lot of talk about how we treat our educators. And I would like to speak to you on the legislative piece. I plead with you, and I beg with you, that we ease up on teachers and that we give them the chance to really reach our children, because test scores is not what it's about. It is really about how many kids we reach, and kids are not gonna do well if they aren't fed. They're not thinking, they're not doing algebra, they're hungry.
And just to respond quickly, we actually have. In the last 2 years, each year, we've passed different bills that are slowly creeping back the number of mandated days that have to be spent on testing. It's a big fight. I can tell you the Teachers Association goes one way, we go one way. I mean, there's a lot of different philosophies about the scoring, and I think each is well-intended. But you're right, we have to find the appropriate balance of testing so we can have some accountability, but also giving the classroom freedom so the teachers can not just teach answers, but teach the ability to think. And that's really what we want our kids to be able to do, is take facts, process them, and learn on their own account. So we have done a couple of changes. There's more to be done, but we're getting there.
Yes, and we appreciate what you've done. To the police officers and the task force, thank you. Thank you for taking into account the mental health needs of our students and in our communities. And I just encourage everyone here to keep doing what you're doing. We are making a difference. And everyone keeping all this in mind, we can help these kids. And I'm living testimony to that, so thank you.
I saw 3 hands. I got to go in order. Don't worry, I'm not coming to you. Don't worry.
Hi, I had a question for Dr. Anda. I understand how the ACE study is being used, and the goal is prevention as far as adverse childhood experiences. How's the data, is it being used to study protective factors and resiliency?
Well, we didn't have the foresight to include that when we did the study in the 90s. There are other groups now that are expanding what we've done to ask about not only protective factors and what those might be, but also community-wide factors like some of those that are being brought up today. Exposure to community violence, poverty, hunger, racism, feeling unsafe in your community. I think that's sort of the next level in terms of research that's out in the field now. It's really, we could spend a whole hour talking about what would be really necessary to study that. It gets really complex in terms of measuring resiliency or protective factors, adversity, and all the wide array of pathways that those two might lead. But I can assure you that there are groups that are doing that now, and that you'll be seeing that over the next 5 or 10 years, so we can understand it better.
I have a hand. Oh, there we go.
Hello, my name's Brandon McAllister. I work for Family Services for Frederick City Housing Authority. And something that I heard, a lot of y'all say was the credibility thing. And me coming from, that type of background as a kid like that, seeing that consistency, showing up, taking that 30-second conversation to see how my day is going, or to take that 30-second conversation to see how that kid is doing. Seeing you show up in the communities over and over and over, that not being there for a month, a year, and then never seeing you again. Once that the data is all done and a little bit got fixed and it got a little bit better, we don't have to go back there anymore. So something that stood out to me was understanding that the book knowledge and all that's great. The college degrees, that's excellent. That's excellent. Like the knowledge though, the experience, relating to these children that they know, you know what, I know what you feel like. That I'm not just going to read out of a book and tell you what you suffer from. That I can tell you through experience, I understand how you feel. So having that credibility and consistency is what's going to pay off. Like I know for me and my coworkers, that's what we try to do. Letting them know that you're nothing different than we've been through those things. But this is how we overcome them. So I just ask that throughout y'all travels, continue to understand that experience, that credibility, it goes a long way with kids just like me. Thanks.
I just want to mention, I'm Robin Handler from the public school system, that this is the first week of school, and with our law enforcement agencies, we are trying to implement Handle with Care, where a notice will go to the school system, and then we will share it with teachers to handle a student with care when they have witnessed a traumatic event or been involved in a traumatic event. So this is our first week back to school, and we're hoping to expand Handle with Care.
I want to touch on what you just said. I'm so appreciative of that. I think it's a phenomenal thing, and I know that works with the police department and everything else, and it's critical. I had a young boy in my advisement group last year, and he missed a day of school, and then he came in. He was kind of out of sorts, and I didn't pick up on why. I started being the tough one, pushing him a little. Hey, what do you mean you didn't do your homework? Come on. A week goes by, and then I find out accidentally that he had come home from school and found his mother dead. And his father made him to continue to go to school. He was getting no counseling. He told them, I don't want to talk about it, so no one told me. And when I found out, I was like, that was pretty vital information I needed to know to help him along this way. No 14-year-old's equipped, no adult's equipped to go through that, much less a 14-year-old alone. And so I'm so grateful to what you're doing. I think it's going to be a huge improvement in our school system because it's going to give the teacher and the school the tools we need to walk with that child through this time. So thank you.
We have time for about 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap the panel part up. Over here.
Hi, everybody. My name's Morgan. My question is to Chief Brito and to Delegate Wilson. You guys would probably have the most insight into this. Without going into too much detail, a couple years ago, I ended up on the wrong side of the law. And I have seen the inside of the Maryland prison system. And we tell ourselves that the prison system is for rehabilitation. But for myself, I have seen enormous government waste and a lot of dignity and respect being taken away from people and a lot of ineffective and underfunded treatment. So on the surface of it, to me, someone who has a bias obviously against it, it seems like a system that has no intention of changing. And obviously this is not anything directed at either of you, but how do we go about changing a system and working within a system that doesn't seem to want to change and doesn't seem to want to work with us?
Let me take that one because actually from when I first got elected in 2014, 2015, we started the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. The Justice Reinvestment Initiative was guided, we all bought in, the governor bought in. The first year was a task force where we brought in the Pew Research Foundation. They had done this in a number of other states to completely do an overhaul review of the criminal justice systems, particularly on incarceration, to determine where the waste is, where the effective programs are, what else needs to be added, and to try to basically work on a two-tier system. Incarceration is part rehabilitative, it's part punitive. But you don't punish people just because they receive a sentence. You look at what the crime was that was committed. You try to track people out, those who are certainly nonviolent offenders. We should be putting on a different track than those who perhaps committed a heinous crime, a violent crime that really injured people. And the Justice Reinvestment System, the first year went through, it came up with recommendations. I was appointed to the work group that tried to put it together into one bill. It ended up being a 126-page bill. It covers everything from pretrial to potential sentences, but the big part is on after a sentence has been rendered. The goal is to use the same amount of money that we're currently using on prisons, but to reduce the population through taking people out of the system who don't need to be there, putting them into the rehabilitative and therapeutic programs that they need to become productive citizens, but keeping the funding level the same so as those populations go down, take that money and reinvest it into even better therapeutic programs, rehabilitative programs, job training programs, re-entry programs. Bill Gertner's here from Gatekeepers. I don't know where he is right now, I can't see him, but I could tell I've worked with him. He was one of the first ones that contacted me when I was in the campaigning. We have worked together, and he serves on the Justice Reinvestment Board. We are finding ways to smartly treat our criminal justice system on that tail end so that we can do exactly what you saw, get rid of that waste, and instead reinvest it in programs that puts better people. This is why it ties into ACE, and I mentioned it in opening comments, because we know that one thing, if you can't prevent the initial adversity in the child's life, we know it's there after it's happened. What can we do to prevent a reoccurrence? Justice reinvestment is largely targeted at targeting that reoccurrence and trying to stop it before it happens so that we can get a person who is now productive, who better understands what his or her role is in a family structure, better understands what his or her role is in the community. We use mediation to get people through the reentry process so when they come out, they have that support group also so that they can succeed. Our whole goal is to get people through to succeed. I appreciate you are absolutely right. Absolutely right. I just want you to know that we have initiated that process. The bulk of that act, even though it was passed 2 years ago, goes into effect October 1st of this year. Because there's so much change in parole and probation, change in social services, change in agencies across the state, we had to give an additional year. Because if you roll it out too fast, guess what happens? It fails, it becomes the butt of jokes, it becomes the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And we want this to succeed so that people succeed. So thank you very much. You're absolutely right, and we are working on it.
Thank you.
My name is Ray Valenzuela. I'm the pastor at the Hagerstown Seventh Adventist Church just across the street. And, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Woodbridge apartment fires. And so I came in contact with our community in an emergency kind of way. I was on my way there because I had some members there, and I got a call from the Red Cross. Can you open it up so we can, your church is a good location for us to make it the center. And it was a blessing for me because, I was able to contact with the Red Cross, police, fire chief. And so we were having a block party in a couple of days where we gave away 125 back to school backpacks. We gave free haircuts to kids in the community. And so it made me aware, and this is a question I have for you guys more, how much more as a minister, as a pastor, I should be or can be involved in our community, whether it's law enforcement, schools. And it's a question for anybody here that likes to say, how much more can we give or be involved as a pastor, as a religious community to, as somebody said, it takes a community, and we want to be part of this community that helps in the process of healing communities.
Let me kind of address that. How much more can you be involved? It's limitless. How much you want to, now the situation you talk about, the fire, that was in the county, that wasn't in the city. Hagerstown Fire Department responded and had major control over that. And I recognize some of the good things that came out of it with all the faith-based communities that we have. In the city of Hagerstown, it's incredible, the faith-based communities that we have, and their collaboration and their compassion that they have, not only for the community, but working together to solve issues. But in jest, it's limitless. You know, don't ever set yourself to that, you know, you're at one level. Whatever you want to do, whatever your heart will take you, that's where you need to go. That's what's important. It's limitless for us. I would never set any constraints on what you can and cannot do. That's not something that's going to be productive for us. But I kind of want to touch on a couple things, and I didn't have an opportunity to respond to your question about credibility. Credibility is incredibly important in law enforcement. You know, how we comport ourselves, how we communicate, and those type of things. Education, you know, you touched on that also. Education is very important. My father used to tell me that, you know, my degrees and a quarter will get me a cup of coffee. It's how you use those things. That's very important. This setting here is very good, but it's not ultimately intimate for really good conversations and things to happen. It's nice. I do these things. I like to talk. I could talk all day to you on a variety of different topics. But it's not that intimate. Now, I want to just tell you something that we're doing in the Hagerstown Police Department that's a little bit different than most. With Tim Morrow, the principal of Antietam Academy, in conjunction with the police department and the mediation center in Washington County, we do something that's called dialogue circles, which are intimate and extremely intimate. And those dialogue circles involve usually anywhere between 3 to 5 police officers and 3 to 5 young people in our community that sometimes have been adversely affected. It's a whole day event that we do, and it's having that conversation that's mediated what is germane to both of us and getting us to understand. At the beginning, you'll see a lot of standoffishness, you know, with people. By the end of the day, there is a collaboration, there's a compassion, there's an understanding for one another. But those intimate conversations in dialogue circles, which we will have every member of the police department that will participate in, are incredibly important for us. You know, those communications. Love all you folks in here, but this is not that intimate. You know, but when you have those face-to-face interactions, that's when really the rubber hits the road, and that's when we get things done, and that's where we understand one another. Because police officers are much more than a uniform, and members in our community are much more than people in our communities. So understanding those things is really germane to the bedrock principle of getting things done and addressing challenges we have in our community.
Thank you. And specific to your question, I would encourage you to connect with the Hagerstown Area Religious Council. We work with a network of churches in the Western neighborhood, and even though you're not directly in that neighborhood, there are other efforts that certainly are relevant to the community where your house of faith is located. Got about 2 or 3 minutes. Just any last thoughts or things that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Also, I'd like to add that I know most of us may be professionals working in some area trying to make people's lives better. Even as a person out helping the community, we can help the agencies that are trying to do things better. I know that the short time that I've known the chief, Hagerstown Police Department came under their accreditation review or whatever, and it was good that people from the community came and shared their experiences. You know, positive experiences that they have with the agency. So even though, you know, we're out helping others, give them a chance to help us. Somebody may want to write that letter of appreciation or whatever, you know, to share those experiences. So they become a stakeholder in our success as well. So look for those chances and opportunities too, especially like the pastor having parishioners or congregation members that are doing things. It's a two-way street. We can scratch each other's backs. It's not always about funding, though it does help.
Anything else? Anybody have anything?
Can I do my infomercial thing?
Go ahead.
Okay. So for the past, 14 years, I've taken children out to national parks for a week-long adventure. We've done Grand Canyon, Yellowstone. I've taken 2 groups from Western Heights to Yellowstone, and this year we want to go to Acadia. I take 10 children with my teaching partner, and it's a life-transforming experience for these kids. And we're starting to gear up now to go in June, and I had some children come to me and say, Mrs. Holcomb, I want to go, but I can't even go to my parents and ask for this kind of money. It's an all-inclusive trip, and it costs $2,000 a kid. So I'm looking for church sponsors, business sponsors, anybody that wants to sponsor a child to have this life-transforming experience. So please see me if you think your organization is interested in that, because we really need community help.
And you will contact Carolyn Holcomb at Western Heights Middle School.
I have cards with me.
What's the phone number? They can find you, right?
Yes.
All right, well, let's give a huge round of applause to our panel. Understand that these are people that took time out of their work. Carolyn went to school this morning, checked in her class, and then ran over here. So while they were doing something else, Brother Andy's over at Head Start. Obviously, Chief of Police. These are people that have other things to do, and they took the time to be here to share their perspective and have conversations. And so we sincerely appreciate that. So thanks again for taking the time. And also, Dr. Robert Anda flew from Georgia to be here. Let's give him a huge round of applause for his time. Specific to the Chief's point about a more intimate conversation, we plan from this point to have more specific conversations with Dr. Anda's organization and ACE Interface to talk about if there is a select group of people in this community where we're doing work and then in the very surrounding neighborhoods, and thinking about what's the actual term that is used here, master practitioner program.
Trainers.
Master trainers.
Yeah.
People that can continue to promote the work, but also be able to provide information and continue to cause that ripple effect in the community. So we're getting ready to move to our next speaker, but just one more round of applause for all folks. Thank you. All right. Well, I think if you were impressed with the depth of feedback that we received from the panel members, you're going to be blown out of the water here by our next speaker. We are just so privileged that he has flown from Los Angeles to join us here at this summit today. So, without giving too much away, I'm going to introduce the CEO of Sanmar, Bruce Anderson.
Flew from Los Angeles to be here. I'm not from Los Angeles. When I got out of high school, when I got out of college, I spent 9 years working in the inner city of Cincinnati. Lived in the city, worked in the city, and I can remember vividly to this day the gunfights outside the house. It was a block away. There was a police officer killed. Crack house right next door. But the thing I remember most is the ever-present sense, pervasive sense of hopelessness. Last year, several of us had the opportunity, a privilege, of going out to Los Angeles and looking at a couple programs. We had the experience of going over to Homeboy Industries, having lunch there, and at Homegirl Bakery. And we were able to meet some of the people there that our speaker, Father Boyle, works with. One of the things that they showed us was a shirt that they sell. And the shirt says, "Nothing stops a bullet like a gun." Yeah. That's true. We can do stand-up, huh? Nothing stops a bullet like a job. And I thought about that, and I thought he's demonstrating is true. But as I thought about it, nothing stops a bullet like hope. And nothing stops a bullet like a man with courage and vision who's willing to speak truth to the hopeless. Father Greg Boyle.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. I recognize I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, so it's got me a little nervous. It's the privilege of my life for 30 years to work with gang members and thousands of them, and have come to know them and love them and be so educated and changed by them. The day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I am closer to God than these folks. People like Joey Ray, a young man who I met in prison. I was chaplain there, and so he ended up coming to work at Homeboy, and he became a much in-demand speaker, so he would always be asked to go to high schools and stuff, and he just loved it and was quite good at it. We were having dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly, and he said, you know, you have to pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. I said, yeah, no shit. That's some good advice there. That's just a way of saying brace yourselves. There's a vision that undergirds your morning here, and it's a vision of wanting things to look differently than they currently look, and it's about somehow creating a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. You know, Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we, in our own particularity, find a way to dismantle the barriers that exclude? And to that end, we stand out at the margins, and we try to locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. The only way to erase the margins is to stand out at them with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, all of us have had this exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. The goal is kinship. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. In fact, all those things that we long for are really byproducts of this undergirding sense that we belong to each other. And so we choose to create a community of kinship. And people will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. And so we try to allow other voices to get heard. So for 30 years I've been working with gang members, and I'm so grateful to them daily as I've been communicating with them even while I'm here in DC. And so one of the things they've taught me is how to text, and I'm so grateful to them because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty good at it, LOL and OMG and BTW. And the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no. And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. I can't be alone in being vexed by this stupid autocorrect thing. I mean, it's the bane of my existence, you know. And once a homegirl named Bertha, she wrote me on a Sunday and she said, "Where you at?" And I said, "Well, I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas." So I'm about to speak to a room of nuns. So I said, "I'm about to speak to a room full of monjas." And I pushed send, and autocorrect told her that I was about to speak to a room full of ninjas. You know, which she thought was pretty darn interesting, you know. And homies, even while I'm here, I'm staying with my brother and his wife in DC, and they're just, you know, hair on fire, and they all mistake me for a ATM machine. And it's like, gosh, I have to finish off my rent, and they're going to cut off my lights. It's all that kind of stuff, only all the time. And I just didn't have any money this one time when a guy wanted me to help him with his rent. And I just wrote, "Things are tight." Then I pushed send, and autocorrect told him, "Thongs are tight." And he wrote back, "Sorry to hear that. You know, what about my rent?" So there I am in a car with two homies, older vatos, Manuel and Poncho, and the two of them, they're going to help me give a talk at a high school. So we finished our morning meeting, which is this big thing we have, about 300 people packed in this reception area. That's how we begin our day. And then we got in the car. So Manuel's in the front seat, Poncho's in the back seat. And older guys, tattooed, been to prison and stuff. And so we're driving to go to give this talk, and Manuel gets an incoming text, and he reads it to himself, and he chuckles. And I say, "What is it?" And he goes, "Oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office." Well, I just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazo as the day was beginning. Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of our workers. And trust me, I would not want this job because this may come as a surprise. Gang members can occasionally be attitudinal. So I say, "What's he say?" He goes, "Oh, hang on, it's dumb. Let me find it here. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now, show them they got the wrong guy." Well, we died laughing. I nearly drove into oncoming traffic. And then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They're from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other, because I remember. And now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? It's important to bridge any distance that exists between us. Even in service, all of you are engaged in service, your kids are engaged in service, our educational system requires that service be part of their path. But there's a distance in service even, you know, service provider, service recipient. You want to bridge even that, you know. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all in need of healing. We're all a cry for help. It's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. Service is where you start, but you don't want to end there, because service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of exquisite mutuality. And that's important. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and he was absolutely the best listener I've ever met in my life. If you were talking to him, nobody else existed, only you, singularly focused. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. But once, quite famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, wow, these farm workers, they sure love you. And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, the feeling's mutual, which of course is the hope. How do we bridge even that distance in our service of the folks on the margins? The truth be told, we don't go to the margins to make a difference there. We go to the margins so that the folks on the margins will make us different. So I remember no homie got more job opportunities through Homeboy Industries than this guy we all called Dreamer. A little mocosito knucklehead I knew since he was a little kid growing up in the projects. And you know, he's doing okay now. He's like in his mid-40s. That makes my ass feel old. But yeah, he's in his mid-40s. But in his early 20s, he was, you know, kind of a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up. I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our social enterprises. This is a bad microphone?
Hold at the top.
Okay.
Hold the bottom.
All right. So self-defecating humor, no shit. So I'm going to presume that you've heard some of that. Anyway, but Caesar, I would find him a Dreamer was his gang name, and we'd find him a job here and there, and he'd always gravitate to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So this was a pattern that kept repeating itself. And so sure enough, he'd finished a 4-week stretch in county jail, a probation violation. And then there he was sitting in front of my desk in my office, and he says what gang members often say, this time it'll be different. And I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone and I called a friend of mine named Gary who ran a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And he had hired homies in the past, so I'm thinking maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, Gary says, yeah, you tell him he can start tomorrow. That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer begins work at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, he's in my office, and I couldn't believe it. I go, Sergio Pedro, I can't believe you're sitting here. You know, híjole, Madre Santa. Here we go all over again, you know. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck, and he says, damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job. And I said, well, gosh. Who? And he looked at me strangely and he said, well, God, of course. Oh, sure, no. No, that would be God, yeah. You thought I was going to say you. I said, no, gosh, God's number one. He said, you are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days. I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now. Well, the only thing I really recall was that the two of us literally fell out of our chairs. We were laughing so hard. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So Homeboy Industries was born 30 years ago when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles called Dolores Mission. And it was nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, making it, according to the LAPD, the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in all of the city. So I buried my first young person in 1988, killed because of this sadness. and I buried my 220th a month ago. Not all from that community, of course, but I work with gang members, so I get asked to do this. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, and so they were wreaking havoc in the projects. They were writing on the walls, selling drugs. They were violent. And so I walked out to them, and I would sort of isolate them. You know, I'd go, hey, you know, if I found a school that would take you, would you go? And to my surprise, they all said, yeah, you know, I would. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So right across the street from the church is our elementary school, grades K to 8, the first 2 floors. But the entire 3rd floor of the school was the convent where the ninjas lived. And so I gathered all the nuns together in the living room, and I sat them down and I said, hey, you know, would you guys mind, you know, moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members? And they said, sure. Literally, that was the extent of their discernment process. And so we were off and running, and this brought gang members in large numbers to the church, not to church services, of course, but to our property, which created something of a disconnect. You know, people started to say, wait a minute, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out. So that was a good gospel challenge, I think. And then they kept saying over and over again, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the projects, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. And so we couldn't wait, so we invented things like crews mainly, you know, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a graffiti removal crew, a crew to build our child care center on the church property. And then in 1992, 25 years ago, was the unrest as a result of the Rodney King beating, and the whole city just absolutely exploded. Every pocket of poverty except one, which was where my parish was. And so LA Times wanted to know why that was the case, and so they asked me, and I said, well, I think it's because we had 60 strategically hired rival gang members working side by side. So maybe these were the characters most likely to torch the place, and so they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, or a reason not to torch their own community. And so that's why. And a movie producer named Ray Stark read the article and summoned me. Now, Ray Stark had, at the time, $500 million. And he asked me, you know, how should he use his money? And now when I look back on it, boy, did I undershoot my request here. But I said, why don't you buy this abandoned bakery across the street from the school? And, you know, it's got ovens. We could put hairnets on rival gang members. They could bake bread. We could call it Homeboy Bakery. That was the extent of my business plan. And Ray Stark said, sure. So we were off and running. And a month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name, which we had previously called ourselves Jobs for a Future, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. Not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew people didn't want gang members in their homes? I did not see that coming. And nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we've backed our way into now. We are the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on our planet, 15,000 folks. 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors trying to reimagine their lives, to cease to plan their funerals and plan their futures instead. We also have started a thing called the Global Homeboy Network. And so we have 147 programs across the country modeled on Homeboy and 16 outside the country. We gather every August with what we call our partners. We just had our 4th annual meeting. And so rather than franchise, we didn't want to become the McDonald's of gang intervention programs, you know, with over 5 billion gang members served, you know. So we much rather wanted to give technical assistance and help people give birth to their own kind of approaches from below. And there's a kind of a, you know, a modality that we have and a strategy and a way of proceeding that all these programs have seemed to embrace, so that's good. So at our place, the centerpiece is our 18-month training program. All the homies want to get in on that because it's a paid gig. And we never call it a job. We don't say that we hire people. We say we bring them in, you know. And we don't want homies who are there for the check. Only those who are there for the change. Because an employed inmate, returning citizen, gang member, may or may not return to prison. And an educated one may or may not. But a healed one, I will make this guarantee and bet my entire life, a healed one will not ever go back to prison, period. Ever. And so we want them to engage in that kind of what we call essential healing, because healing, of course, ends in the graveyard, but there's an essential healing that if you can get through that, then you re-identify who you are, you engage in active attachment repair, you deal with what you've just spent the morning talking about, and then you leave after 18 months, and the world will throw at you what it will, but this time you won't be toppled, and that's kind of the goal. So we have lots of classes, everything that you would imagine, anger management and grief and loss, and we still have a school and GED and domestic violence stuff, and we have free tattoo removal. No place on our planet removes more tattoos than we do. We're 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, 1 paid physician assistant, and 47 volunteer doctors, 3 laser machines. We have a designated clinic. It's essential when you go to the margins is to listen to folks at the margins, and so tattoo removal was born not because I thought it was a good idea, but because you listen. You know, a homie came, and we started it because of this guy named Frank, who 2 days out of Corcoran State Prison, I had never met him, and he's sitting in front of my desk and tattooed on his forehead like a big old billboard filling the entire space, and pardon my French here, it said, "Fuck the world." And Frank looked at me and he said, "You know, I am having a hard time finding a job." And I say, "Well, Frank, you know, maybe we could put our heads together on this one, you know." And I'm thinking, where do I send him? You know, to McDonald's, you know, and do you want fries with that? No, I don't want fries. So naturally, I hired him, and he bagged bread for like 2 years at our bakery. And I went on the lookout for a doctor, a dermatologist with a laser machine. I found one at White Memorial Hospital. He donated 1 hour a month to chip away on Frank's forehead and a few others. And before too long, I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted this service. So we couldn't really stay with that arrangement. Parentheses, Frank is currently a security guard at a movie in Hollywood. And there is no trace left of the dumbest thing he had ever done in his life, and proving once and for all, as Sister Helen Prejean tells us, everyone is a whole lot more than the worst things they've ever done. And so we have all our social enterprises. Homeboy Bakery is thriving. Homeboy Homegirl merchandise, where we sell our logo stuff. Homeboy Silk Screen, that's been around for about 23 years. 2,500 customers from all over the country, high quality work, reasonably priced. We UPS to Hagerstown. I'm just saying. We have Homeboy Diners, the only place you can get food at City Hall. We have a restaurant at LAX Terminal 4, American Airlines Terminal. We have a thing called Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips and salsas and all the Ralph's supermarkets from mid-state to San Diego. We have farmers markets. We have Homeboy Recycling, that's our newest venture, e-waste. And then Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. And they cater. It's a kind of a, if you go to the restaurant there, it's kind of a who's who. You're never going to be in there without some celeb or elected official or somebody, you know, like Jim Carrey, the movie star, goes there often, and Jack Black, and once all the Dodgers came, and let's see, once, you know, with only 2 hours notice, Vice President Joe Biden came. Motorcade and Entourage and selfies with Uncle Joe. I wasn't there. I was at on my annual silent retreat, so I didn't know about it till he came back. And I see a homie named Louie, and Louie's going to debrief me. While you were gone, we were visited by an MVP. I said, do you mean a VIP? That one, VIP. Damn, gee, imagine here at Homeboy Industries, we were visited by the Vice President of the United States, Mick Romney. And I think you can file that one under all white guys look alike. And I think as a result, we added a current affairs class, now that I think of it. But most famously, Diane Keaton showed up for lunch, Oscar-winning actress, and she, Annie Hall and Godfather movies, and she's there with a regular guy who's there once a week, and her waitress is Glenda. Now, Glenda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed, gang member, felon, was in prison for a lot of years. She has no idea who this Diane Keaton is, and she's, and she gives her a menu, and Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 dishes she particularly likes, and Diane Keaton says, well, I'll have that second one. That sounds really good. And it's at that moment something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. You know, like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Oh my God, that just took my breath away when I heard it. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress and attitudinal waitress. Exactly what God had in mind, and if you'll permit me. Jesus says to the gathered, that you may be one. I suppose he could have been more self-referential, but no, it's about us. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. We're called only to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it. That's what the prophet Habakkuk tells us. All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who, through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. We don't believe in it. We believe in holding the mirror up and telling people the truth, knowing that your truth is my truth and my truth is a gang member's truth. It's all the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks, especially those on the margins, as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No balls can keep that out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But we know at Homeboy, part of the task is you have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Shame and disgrace is really the principal suffering of the poor. And so you kind of want to find the values that, again, if you'll permit me, expressed in the Acts of the Apostles. It's not just a quaint snapshot of life in the earliest Christian community, but things leap out, notions like see how they love one another, and there's nobody needy in this community. My favorite one is an odd one, where it says simply, and awe came upon everyone. And it seems to suggest that the greatest measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So I get invited to give a lot of talks, and I was invited once to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And I say yes to stuff, virtually everything, and then I don't pay that much attention to the fine print. And so I knew it was an all-day gang-in service, from 9 to 5. I knew that. I figured I'd be a keynote or maybe speak at lunch or something. And then I discovered that a week before I am to fly, I pull out the letter, and in the not-so-fine print it says that it is a gang-in service from 9 to 5. I am to be the only speaker at this entire day's event. And so I quickly called two trainees, homies, Andre and Jose, into my office, and I said, look, you're flying with me at the end of the week to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up in front of 600 social workers, and he's like 25 at the time, and a gang member, been to prison, tattooed. He part of our training program, so he's done a lot of things, began in what we call the humble place, which is you just clean urinals for 3 months, and then he ended up as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man really solid in his own recovery. Now he's helping younger homies with their addiction issues. Not only a prisoner, former prisoner, but also he was a homeless man for a stretch and a heroin addict for an even longer stretch. So he gets up in front of these 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp, and he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish, he said. And then they did what you just did, so we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage. She knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid, and she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For here is the truth of the matter. If we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. On the weekends, although this weekend not, because I'm here all weekend, I say masses as a priest in all these probation camps. We have a lot of them in juvenile halls in LA County. And so, but then my Saturdays are always the same. You know, I always have to race back to Dolores Mission because I've been there now for 35 years, so I know everybody, and homies always ask me to do stuff, you know, so 1 o'clock baptism, 2 o'clock wedding, 3 o'clock quinceañera when a girl turns 15, 4 o'clock exorcism, you know. Just checking to see if you're still listening to me. So this one day, a Saturday, I had just done 2 masses. They're kind of far from town, so I get in, it's like 12:30. I go, gosh, I have a half hour before my baptism. So I race over to my office when, at those days, it was a storefront on First Street. And, I'm content and feliz. I'm opening the mail. I'm all by myself. When all of a sudden this woman walks in, and I find out later her name is Lisa. She's like in her mid-30s. This is the first time she's ever stepped foot in my office. And she's kind of well known on the streets. She's a prostitute. She's a heroin addict, covered in tattoos, a gang member, a felon. She's kind of famous for being a gritona, which means she screams a lot. She's always screaming at the bartender next door who throws her out of the bar daily. Back in the day when we used to have pay phones, she would scream into pay phones on First Street, just let me stay tonight. pleading with family or friends. And this is the first time she's ever stepped foot in my office, and I'm noticing, oh gosh, okay, now it's 12 minutes to 1 in my baptism. She comes right into my office and she plunks herself down and she launches right in. I need help. I've been to like 50 rehabs. I'm known all over, nationwide. Went to Catholic schools all my life, she says. I even graduated from Sacred Heart High School in Lincoln Heights. In fact, first time I ever used heroin was right after I graduated. And I've been trying to stop since the moment I began. And I watched as she leaned her head against the wall behind her, and her eyes became like two ponds, water rising to meet its edges and spilling over. And she cried and she cried. Till finally she leveled her gaze at me and she said, I am a disgrace. And suddenly her shame met mine, because when I had seen her step into my office that day, I had mistaken her for an interruption. If we stay strangers to our own wounds and our own brokenness, then we will feel tempted to despise the wounded. In the end, we're called to go to the margins and to widen the circle. In the end, we're called to create a community of kinship where there is exquisite mutuality, no us or them. Once I was interviewed on the Christian Broadcasting Network, and the woman asked me what we do at Homeboy, so I told her everything I told you. And afterwards, she kind of made a face, and she said, yeah, but how much time do you spend each day, at Homeboy Industries, praising God? And I didn't know what to say, so I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer. But it kind of begs this question for me, which is like, what kind of praise does God have any interest in? So let me finish with this one last story. I get invited sometimes by universities who have forced their students to read my book against their will to speak. So Gonzaga University, which is my alma mater in Spokane, said, can you come? And I said, sure. And then they asked me to bring two homies with me. And so, and I always do it if they're going to pay for it, and I always pick homies in the same way. I always pick rivals, enemies, just so they have to share the same hotel room together just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. It's funny, it reminds me of DC, because I had not long ago brought two homies, and we were going to stay with my brother and his wife, and we were in LAX and getting ready to fly, and this homie, older guy, says, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yes, it's actually a requirement. You can fly American from this moment forward. So So I picked two homies, Mario and Bobby. Bobby, African-American gang member, worked in the bakery, and Mario worked in our merchandise store at the time, which is on the premises of our headquarters. I've done this so many times, men and women, maybe 1,000 times at this point, but I've never picked anyone more terrified of flying than this kid, Mario. I mean, he was absolutely panicked and terrified. In fact, he was hyperventilating, We hadn't even gotten on the plane yet. So we were flying out of Burbank Airport, which is a small airport, big bay windows, and Southwest Airlines principally, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute to get on the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac, and Burbank has the benefit of having the stairs that go to the front of the plane, but also the stairs that go to the back of the plane, And so I'm sitting there with Mario. Bobby's off walking somewhere, and our plane arrives. It's early morning. And I said, that's our plane. And I go, oh my God, he may die before we actually climb those stairs, And then I see our flight crew arrives, and two female flight attendants both have 2 large cups of Starbucks coffee, and the two of them are schlepping up the front steps and to get onto the plane, and Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? You each do a 7-minute snapshot of your stories, just like you told today, and so that I can include you in the question and answer at the end of the thing. And they were terrified, especially Mario, but they did a good job. And then I did my thing, and then we stand in front of the podium, and Mario and Bobby are on either side of me, and I said, well, let's do questions. Yeah, yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario stands up to the microphone, and he clutches it, and he says, tall drink of water, very skinny. Yes. And he's just terrified, And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter, and they're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone and he's trembling, and I can feel the emotion rising in him, and he's getting a damn hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say when suddenly he blurts out, and as soon as he says those 2 words, he retreats back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed retreat, and he trembles all the more, but he wants to get this sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving. You are kind. You are gentle. You are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed with emotion that this room full of strangers had decided to return him to himself. And they, in turn, were returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. And a room full of strangers acknowledge that Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. And so we go to the margins, and the margins get erased because we stood there. Look under your feet, you'll see it. And the circle of compassion widens, and the power of tenderness is compelling.
Thanks so much to Father Greg Boyle. You know, as we think about why we do these trainings, you know, it's about 5 years ago, some folks from Sanmar, we went to a training and we heard a variety of speakers that talked about creative and different ways to approach social issues. And we knew from years and years of serving children, after something had happened, that we wanted to try to do things differently. And so my hope is that by offering trainings like this in our community, that it creates a ripple effect, that there are institutions here that think about what does this